for Development Economics and the Econometric Society. We are honored to have with us Professor Thomas Piketty from Paris School of Economics as our speaker and Professor Mudit Kapoor as the chair for this plenary session. I also request Professor Ram Singh, Director of Delhi School of Economics, and Dr. Manish Kumar, Executive Director, Center for Development Economics, to kindly come up to the dais for the group photograph. Thank you, everyone. Professor Mudit Kapoor is Professor of Economics at the Indian Statistical Institute, Delhi. Professor Kapoor has published in esteemed academic journals such as the Journal of Econometrics, Review of Economics and Statistics, Regional Science and Urban Economics, and the Journal of Financial Intermediation. In addition to his role at ISI, he has served as an assistant professor and research fellow at Indian School of Business, Hyderabad. Now, I would like to request Professor Kapoor to kindly commence the session.
I think without any further delay, we are here to listen to Professor Piketty. So I think, so can you just start?
Yeah, why not? Yeah, here we are.
This is
Yep.
for next.
Yep.
This is for previous.
Okay. Okay, so thanks a lot for the invitation, and I'm very glad to be here with you. So we're, I'm gonna talk this morning and this afternoon about some of the research I have been doing on global inequality and redistribution. And so what we're going to do is that, so this morning I'm going to stress, the comparative and historical dimension. And this afternoon I will deal more with the case of India, and then I will move to the issue of political cleavage about inequality and the political economy of redistribution. So let me say a little more about the kind of material I'm going to show you in this presentation. I would like also to apologize in advance in case my voice tends to disappear. I think it should be okay, but it's not great right now. Plus, I with the jet lag, I might look a bit tired, but don't worry, I'm going to with time, I should be more awake. Also, what I plan to do is, so we have 1 hour and a half. So what my plan is to have to stop to talk for about 50 minutes, 1 hour, and then to have really 30 minutes with open questions where I can come back to any topics that I discussed during the talk. But please interrupt me also during the first part of the talk. So if there's any clarification question which is directly related to data or anything I am showing, I think it's just good that you raise your hand and speak right away, and it will be better for everybody, and it will also accelerate the process of waking me up, so that's good for everyone, I think. Okay, so the data I'm going to present, a big part is going to come from the World Inequality Database. So this is a database that you can access online very easily. This is wid.world. And I will say a few words in a minute about this database and how the data was constructed. But basically, this is, we're trying in this database to offer the most extensive available database on the evolution of the distribution of income and wealth, both between countries, within countries, and from an historical perspective, going back in some case to the 19th century, or even a bit before in a few cases, and at least to cover most of the 20th century until today when we can. So I will present some material from this. Some of the graph figures I will present come from the World Inequality Report 2022, and we every 4 years at the World Inequality Lab we publish a sort of synthesis of our findings in the form of the World Inequality Report. We'll present a new one in 2026, but in fact, on the website, we have new data almost every week or so for certain countries, and so some of the data I will present comes from this regular update. I will talk about, I will present also some material from this book, My Brief History of Equality, which was published last year, or I guess 2 years ago in English. And that will be part of the historical materials that I will present. I will also present, but probably more this afternoon, some results from our work on inequality in India. So there are actually 2 papers. One is called Income and Wealth Inequality in India, 1922-2023, The Rise of the Billionaire Raj. So this is joint work with Nitin Bharti, Lucas Chancel and Anmol Somanchi. And then we have this paper called Toward Tax Justice, Wealth Redistribution in India, proposal based on latest inequality estimates, which we published shortly after that. And I will show you some material. And finally, and this will be really this afternoon, I will present some results from this other collective project called the World Political Cleavage and Inequality Database, which is another publicly available data set which you will find online at wpid.world. We published a book at Harvard University Press 2 years ago called Political Cleavages and Social Inequalities, a study of 50 democracies, 1948-2020, with Amaury Guetin, Clara Martinez-Tolenado, and over 30, 40 researchers participated to this book and to the database. Basically, what we do in this research is to try to collect systematic data on how people vote. Who votes for whom, who votes for which party in different countries. Very simple descriptive questions. If you rank voters by income, by education, type of occupation, gender, religion, whatever, how do they vote for, and how does this change over time? And what's new here is that we try to collect, we have tried to collect in a very systematic manner all post-electoral survey in 50 democracies since 1948. So this includes most Western democracies. That's about half of the 50, 25. But there's also 25 or so countries that are outside the West. So of course there's India, but there's also Brazil, countries in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we are trying to compare also the pattern of what we call left-right voting, or what maybe we used to call left-right voting in Western electoral democracies, with the kind of pattern that we see in other countries. The important point that we are trying to make in this research is that whether you describe the party system in a given country as left, right, or nationalist, or progressive, or whatever the way you want to call it, people don't vote at random. Okay, so people with different socioeconomic characteristics do vote for different parties in a sort of usually very stable manner. I mean, there are also some transformation, but they don't vote at random. And trying to document in a systematic manner how people actually vote in different countries can also help you better understand the substance of the political conflict and the discourse of the political parties, at least as they are perceived by the voters, to which they try to address. So anyway, this is, I will cover this afternoon, and so this morning is more about the study of distribution of income and wealth and inequality as such. We will see that policies, institution, taxation, education are very important to understand the evolution of inequality. And then this afternoon, we will spend more time trying to understand where these policies, change in policies come from. Why do we have redistribution in some cases and not, and then looking at the political economy part and the structure of political cleavage can be interesting in order to better understand this political economy aspect, which we will discuss more this afternoon. So that's the plan. So if there's no question, let me start with some simple data from the World Inequality database. So if some of you attended the panel session yesterday, I'm going to repeat a little bit some of the materials that I presented yesterday, but I will try to go fast in order to present a new material, in particular, a more explicit historical perspective to better understand this. So just a few words about the World Inequality database. So this started, we started this project almost 20 years ago, more than 15 years ago, with Tony Atkinson and Emmanuel Saez. So I had started to work on the long-run evolution of income inequality in France more than 20 years ago. Then with Tony Atkinson, we extended this project to most Western countries, to Britain with Tony. We did the case of the United States with Emmanuel Saez, where we uncovered the very large rise of the top 1% share in the US more than 20 years ago, and this had quite a large impact on public debate. And then we moved on to try to cover the entire world and not just rich countries, and try to cover the full distribution of income and just not top income shares. And then try to cover wealth inequality and not just income inequality, and then gender inequality, and then carbon emission. And then, so, this is a project that has started with a few countries looking at top income shares, and gradually it has extended and it has become a much bigger project. And now, so if you go on the website, if you go on the methodology section, you will find hundreds and hundreds of pages of methodological documents. All the computer codes are available on the GitHub platform associated to the website. So, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into all the details of the methodology. All I can say is everything is online, everything is documented, and at the same time, everything is imperfect, and everything can be improved, and everything should be improved, and everything will be improved, and, please participate. So, this is really an ongoing participative collective project. So you will also find on the website the list of all researchers that have been involved in the project, which we call the World Inequality Database Fellow. We have now more than 200 of them all around the world, several in India, who have contributed directly, indirectly to the database. Just to summarize, we are really trying to combine all the data sources that can be used to study inequality. So household surveys are, of course, very useful. There are several problems with household surveys. The top of the distribution is not well covered, and you have limited historical availability. So this is why, in order to study the long-run evolution of income distribution, economists and historians and statisticians have, for a long time, tried to use other sources as well, including administrative data sources and tax data in particular. So as you may know, one of the first important historical study in this area was the work by Simon Kuznets in the 1950s. So, Simon Kuznets was the first researcher to try to combine income tax data with national accounts. So he was also one of the first researchers to produce national accounts, so estimates of national income for the United States. So as many of you may know, in the interwar period, there was no national account. So, in the Great Depression of the 1930s, everybody could see that national income was falling, but nobody was able to measure that and to say which sector. And so this is after this big historical trauma that national accounts developed. And this was first developed by researchers, and before this was given to Statistical Institute and National Statistical Administration to update. But sort of conceptual basis, and the first empirical estimate was performed by researchers, in particular Simon Kuznets in the United States. And then the next step, which Simon Kuznets tried to take up in the 1950s, was to say, okay, now that we know national income of the US, I would like to know the distribution of national income. So how much is going to the top 10%, to the bottom 50%, etc. So what he did was to use the income tax data. So the income tax in the US had been created in 1913. So you have income tax data starting in 1913. In the interwar period, you have no more than 10, 20% of the population paying the income tax in the US. So it's a little bit like India today. You have like 10% or a bit of the population paying the income tax. And then after the war, it increased to, and today it's like 90%. But for the interwar period and until the 50s, you can use this income tax data not to look at the entire distribution, but at least you can look at the top 10% of the population. So that's what Kuznets did. And so in 1953, Kuznets published his famous study showing the evolution of the top 10% share in the US between 1913 and 1948. So this was only one country over 35 years, but this was the first time an economist was actually producing a statistical series on income distribution. So economists, had been talking about distribution forever, Ricardo, Marx, everybody was talking about distribution, but they had no real data, actually no statistical series to say whether the inequality increased, decline. So Kuznets was the first one to come with this, and he had a very striking finding, which was a big compression of inequality in the United States over this period of time, with a big decline in the top 10% share. Now, the interpretation he proposed was very tentative, and it was very much in the sort of the time of the Cold War, and the message was basically, well, it was ambiguous, because if you really read Kuznets, he was aware that the war, the Great Depression, the change in policy, all of these events played a role in this decline in inequality. But then at the end of his talk, he was like president of the American Economic Association at the time, and he has this famous article published in American Economic Review 1955, where at the end of his presidential speech, he says, okay, maybe these extraordinary events played a role, but maybe also there's a more sort of natural mechanical process leading to a decline in inequality in advanced stages of capitalist economic development, which he viewed the US from 1910 to 1950 as an example. And he came with this famous sort of two-sector view of economic development, where initially when you go from agriculture to manufacturing, you increase inequality because only a minority of the population is benefiting from industrialization, the new sector. But then as everybody joins the high productivity sector in sort of advanced stages of development, the inequality will compress. And he said, okay, maybe that's partly what has been going on in the US. Now, to be honest, when you look at the data today, it's not so clear that this two-sector model is the right model to think about what was going on. And the institutional transformation, policy transformation, shocks of the time are probably more important to understand what happened. But, Kuznets was writing at a time where, also for political reason, I think he was trying to send an optimistic message to the developing world, saying, okay, please don't mess up, don't do things wrong, don't become communist, don't do such wrong things, just wait. And at some point, inequality will decline, just like it finally did in the US. But anyway, this is just saying that two things. First is that interpretation of this of data on inequality is always complicated, and I don't claim we have today the perfect interpretation. We try to give interpretation, but we are not in the area of controlled experiment. Okay, we are not going to rewrite the history of the 20th century or the globalization of the recent decades with a different set of parameters. So we have to do with what we have. We have to try to interpret our historical series the best we can, and we all have to be modest in our interpretation. I try to present what I view as the most plausible interpretation, but there's going to be no econometric miracle coming from controlled experiment or fancy econometric technique. At some point we have this historical experience coming from a number of countries, and we have to do with what we have. The other thing which this example of Kuznets illustrates is that we are all sort of working in the footsteps of others. So in a way, what we have been doing in this World Inequality Database is simply to generalize what was started by Kuznets. Atkinson, also in the 1970s, wrote a very beautiful book on the long-run evolution of concentration of wealth, and not just income. So Kuznets was looking at income, and in the 1970s, Atkinson published a book on the long-run concentration of wealth using historical inheritance data from the UK rather than the US. So we are really working in this tradition. And, we did not invent anything new in a way. We are just lucky to be working at a time where digital technology allows us to collect data and to organize international network of researchers at a much bigger scale than Kuznets in the 50s or Atkinson in the 70s. And so that's what we did. So let me start by showing you a sort of snapshot of inequality, and then we will go back through time and look at some historical evolution. But so what is this? So here you have on this map the top 10% national income share. So maybe I don't know how well you see the color, but basically the darker you are, the more inequality. So the more red color, the top 10% income share goes from 51 to 67%, and the more yellow color, it goes from 21 to 35%. So just we're talking about 10% of the population. So if you had complete equality, they should have 10% of total income. With complete inequality, they should have 100% of total income. So of course, the reality is always in between. In practice, it doesn't go from 10 to 100, but it goes from, say, 20 to 70, which is already huge variation. And so 2025 will be typically in Nordic Europe, and 70 or 75, 65, 70 will be in South Africa. India, according to our estimates, is around 55 to 60, which makes it close to Brazil or Mexico, and quite high in the top of the list. Now, these estimates are based on what we call the DINA methodology, distributional national accounts, where we try to reconcile national accounts with survey data, with income tax data, with all data sources that we can put together. So we never take any source as given. So of course, income tax data is imperfect. You have tax evasion, so you have to correct it. Household survey data is based on self-reported data, is very imperfect also. And our experience is that at the top of the distribution, survey data is really not good at all. And income tax data, even in countries where there's a lot of tax evasion and tax administration is less than perfect, gives you levels of top income, say in top 10% group, which is always a lot larger than in survey. So even if it's a lower bound, it's still better than in survey. So you need to combine all of this, reconcile this with national accounts. If you have some missing income categories for certain types of capital income, etc., you need to upgrade certain income groups to do that. We are trying to do this in the most consistent possible manner and most possible, as transparently as possible. We don't claim this is perfect. The data sources we have at our disposal are always imperfect. As soon as we get new data, we update, and sometimes we change significantly our conclusion. All I can say is that this is more comparable over time than any other database and more comparable across countries, in the sense that sometimes if you use for instance the Gini coefficient or the other inequality estimates published, for instance, by the World Bank, they will be based only on survey for many developing countries, Whereas for developed countries, say in the US, they will be using, in effect, a lot of administrative tax information. So the level of inequality you will get will not be comparable. Typically, if you do that, you will find that there's much less inequality in countries where you only use the survey. So you will find that, say, Sub-Saharan Africa is very equal as compared to US, except that as soon as you can access tax data in some Sub-Saharan African countries, and we've been able to develop a research project with tax administration in a number of Sub-Saharan African countries, not only South Africa, where access to data has been possible for a long time, but also some countries in West Africa, East Africa. Every time we can access this data, we upgrade the inequality estimate a lot. So this is what we've tried to do in a systematic manner, based on what's available in the different regions. And the big picture that we get to summarize is that as of today, so this is data for the latest year available. This will be 2022, 2021, depending on the country, sometime a bit before, but we try to update the data very regularly. The big picture is that the top 10% income share is going to be larger in general in the south and in developing countries, with large variation. In each region of the world, you have so if you look at Latin America is pretty unequal in general, but you will see if you look in details that Argentina is, for instance, is going to be less unequal than Chile and Brazil, which you can relate to also to the particular history of the welfare state in Argentina, which was somewhat more developed than Brazil or Chile. There will be a lot to say on every region of the world and lots of comparison, which we are not going to have the time to make here. But the big picture is that countries in Europe, and to a lesser extent North America, Japan, are somewhat less unequal, significantly less unequal than countries in the global south. Now, this is true for the top 10% income share. This is also true, if you look at the other side, which is the bottom 50% income share. Now, what's missing is whatever share is missing, it goes to the 40% in the middle by construction. I should say, if you go to the website, you have all the data percentile by percentile. And so here I'm looking at simple groupings, bottom 50%, top 10%, because I think that's a useful simplification. But you have all the percentile and also the tenths of percentile at the top, and more refined data at the top of the distribution. So if we look now at the bottom 50% income share, again, to understand the orders of magnitude, we are talking of 50% of the population, so they should, if you had complete equality, they should have 50% of income. In practice, and if you had complete inequality, they would have 0% of total income. In practice, they have always between 0 and 50. They have between 5 and 25, 30. So the lowest level we have it will be South Africa with about 5% of total income for the bottom 50% share. And in some countries in Nordic Europe, you have up to 29%. So it goes from 5 to 30. So it doesn't go from 0 to 50, but 5 to 30 is already a huge gap. Is this working? Yes, I think. No, that's. Is this working? I think this is not working anymore. So okay. I can try to shout, but I don't think this will help my. This is back. Okay, good. So just again, the simple orders of magnitude. If if you're in Nordic Europe and you are the bottom 50% and you have about 25-30% of total income, it means that your average income is between 50 and 60% of the average income of the rest of the population on average. So you are, of course, you are poorer than average. You are, after all, you are the bottom 50%, but you are not hugely poorer than average. The gap between you and the average in the society, and even more so with the median, it will be rather limited. If you're in South Africa, where the bottom 50% has 5% of total income, what this means is that your average income is 10% of the average of the population. So, there's a huge gap in terms of money, but in many other dimensions as well with the average of the population. So this variation in inequality level are really enormous. So this is always after cash transfer. Also, all cash transfer are taken into account. We also have estimate taking into account the in-kind transfer, where the gaps will be, the bottom 50% share typically will increase, but it will increase everywhere, and sometimes even more so in richer countries where you have large in-kind transfer. So the gaps between countries will not be reduced, will still be enormous. Now that's very important, because you see, basically the first conclusion I want you to have in mind is that the distribution matters a lot, in the sense that the variation means that for a same GDP per capita, for a same average income level, differences in the distribution can change enormously the basic level of poverty in a country. So, for a same average income, whether the share going to the bottom 50% is going to be 5 or 25% of total income, is going to change. This is going to change the average income of the bottom 50% by a factor of 1 to 5 for a same GDP per capita. So this means that, ignoring the distribution and just saying, okay, we only care about the size of the pie and don't worry about the distribution, that is not very convincing, because the variation in the distribution, in effect, are as important as the variation in per capita GDP with a factor of 1 to 5. So we should care about both. And as I will argue, in fact, historically, we get even more growth in GDP per capita. Also, if we have a bigger share for the bottom 50%, if we have less inequality, so that in effect you gain on both grounds. But in any case, the orders of magnitude in differences in distribution are so large that we need to care about them, whatever your conclusion will be, because just these variations are very important. What this also shows is that I tend to prefer this kind of indicators of inequality, bottom 50% share, top 10% share, rather than Gini coefficient, because this gives you, these income shares, forces you to think in more concrete terms about the actual income levels of the different groups. Whether when you have a Gini coefficient, it's sort of very abstract. You don't really understand what it means. Sometimes it's also a way for the researchers to put under the carpet a lot of crappy data at the top of the distribution. Whereas here, by showing the different income shares, you have to show what you have, and sometimes you realize, some of the data that's not plausible or not consistent. Now, we also have the Gini coefficient. By construction, we have the full distribution for all percentiles. So on the World Inequality Database, you can download the Gini coefficient if you want, but we force researchers who want to download the Gini coefficient to download also the income shares going to the different groups, so that they think a little bit more concretely about the income shares. So that's lesson number one from this world map, is that there is a lot of variation. The lesson number two, as we are going to see a bit later when I show you historical graph, is that these big variations that you see across the world, they have not been there forever. And in fact, when you go back through time, you will see that, for instance, European countries 1 century ago were comparable to Latin America or even India today in terms of distribution of income. So typically the top 10% share, which is today around 25, 30, sometimes 35% in Europe, was 50, 55, 60% 1 century ago. So these things change over time, and this is where, as we will see, transformation of institutions, transformation in social policy, economic policy, taxation, education is going to play a very important a very important role. So that will be, that's also very important, and I will come back on this a bit later. Now, in the World Inequality Database, as I was saying, we started with income data, then we moved to wealth distribution. So here I show you just one sort of summary graph coming from the World Inequality Report 2022, showing the concentration of wealth in different regions of the world. But if you go online on the World Inequality Database, you will have series, again, percentile by percentile for each country. The bottom line finding is that wealth inequality is always a lot larger than income inequality. And the historical reduction in wealth inequality has been less substantial even in developed countries than the historical reduction of income inequality. Although there's also been some reduction, but basically today, to summarize what we have here, the top 10% share in terms of wealth is always at least 60 or even 70, 75%, and the bottom 50% share in blue is always less than 5%. So as compared to the numbers I just showed you for income, you can see it's a lot more extreme. I should say this is for the entire population, but this is almost the same numbers within each age group. So this is not due to the fact that the young are poor and they're all going to become rich. No, this is there's a little bit of an age effect, but it's not so big. So we have data, within the 25 to 39 age group, within the 40 to 59, within the 60 and over, and the numbers are very close. So say, the bottom 50% share is going to be 5% or 4% for the entire population, and it's going to go to 7% for a given age group or 8%, but the level of concentration of wealth is going to be very large, which also means that this concentration of wealth translates almost mechanically into the concentration of inheritance. So if you look at the new generation of children, how much they receive in wealth from their parents, well, the bottom 50% of children is going to receive 5% of total inheritance, and the top 10% of children 60 or 70% of total inheritance. And that's, quite important to have in mind if we think about the perpetuation of inequalities, the issue of equality of opportunity, which many people claim they care about, but then when it comes to practicalities, sometimes people are a bit less sanguine and a bit more ready to go to see the implications of their objective. So that's a very important part of inequality, and we will come back on this and talk about future prospect for the distribution of wealth in the future. We at the World Inequality Lab, we have also developed a large project to have comparative measures of gender inequality. So there's one simple indicator of gender inequality which we particularly like, which is simply the female labor income share. So you compute the share of women in total labor income, including wage labor, but also self-employment income, and you have a lot of unpaid family work among women in the agricultural sector, other sectors. Now, the bottom line is that the woman's share in total labor income is always a lot less than 50%, although women's share in total labor time is always more than 50% if you include domestic labor. So in every country where you have time use survey, women work more than men. They have a bit less market labor, but they have so much more domestic labor that the gap can be enormous. You can even in countries in South Asia, you can have a woman up over 60 hours per week of work if you add economic labor, domestic labor, when men will be at 45 or 50. So quite large gaps. I mean, everybody is working more in poorer countries, but women work particularly more. They also work more in rich countries. There's no exception to this pattern. And there's no exceptions to the reverse pattern, which is that they get less in terms of money income. Now, you can say, okay, the good news is that this is improving. this is true, except that, in fact, there are some examples of countries where it's deteriorating, like China, which has to do with the fact that you have, there are several effects here. There's a little bit of a decline in women participation, starting from a very high level, because in all, as in all communist countries, you had relatively high women participation, which has declined a little bit in recent decades. But most importantly, this is rising inequality at the top of the distribution in China. So, although the total inequality is less in China than, say, in India, but there's still been rising inequality in China. And in top wage groups, it's mostly men, basically, everywhere in China, just like everywhere else. And so if the share going to the top increases, everything equals, that's going to increase the share of men and decrease the share of women. Now, this effect of rising top 1% men, you see it everywhere, but in other parts of the world, the opposite effect of rising women participation is counteracting this effect, and actually more than counterbalancing this effect, and this is why the women share still tends to increase in other regions of the world. But in China, the participation effect is not doing that. So. The other thing is that in South Asia, the share of women is particularly low. It's even lower in Middle East, North Africa. Now, if you take more a longer time span, which we couldn't do for all regions of the world, but we can do for Europe, for instance, if you go back to 1970, the women's share in Europe in labor income was about 20%. So not very different from South Asia today, or not a bit higher than MENA today, but not. So this is saying that, again, these things change, and you don't have, the idea that you have a sort of permanent cultural determinants, and, some countries where, the gender inequality will always be enormous, and some countries where it's not exactly how it works. These things can change, and they could change even faster, but probably they require deep change in social norms, and in some cases of explicit policies to make things change faster. And the last dimension of inequality that we have looked at in the World Inequality Database is environmental inequality in terms of distribution of carbon emissions. So again, I will come back more to this probably this afternoon. What I want to stress here is what we offer in the World Inequality Database is a decomposition of carbon emission, not only between countries, which we are all very accustomed to the fact that average emission in India is going to be 2 tons or 3 tons per capita, whereas in the US it's going to be 20 tons per capita. So we are all accustomed to this kind of numbers when we look at between country emissions. What's different is that here we distribute these emissions within each country using consumption, expenditure data, and whatever data we have to sort of look at the carbon content of the consumption and investment pattern of the different household. And the bottom line is that there's very large inequality within each country. And so if you look at Europe, the bottom 50% in Europe has an average emission of 5.1, which is less than the average emission of the top 10% in South and Southeast Asia, which is 10.6. So, which is saying, this is not I'm not saying that the top 10% in India should compensate the bottom 50% in Europe for their emission, because, of course, you have the historical record in emissions by the West, which is a lot bigger than that of India. So you have to look at the whole history of these things. But this is just saying that you cannot just look at country averages, because if you treat everybody in a country as if they were all responsible for the same quantity of emission, or if you do what people sometimes recommend, which is a sort of big proportional carbon tax or a big proportional increase in energy prices, where everybody should make the same effort and reduce their emission or energy consumption in the same proportion, you know, people at the bottom, if you think in Europe, so, you know, in my country, in France, there was this yellow vest movement a couple of years ago where basically this followed a big increase in the carbon tax. So this was supposed to be proportional carbon tax, so eating everybody in proportion to your energy consumption and carbon emission, except that, the people who were in the bottom 50%, if they have an emission of 5 tons, whereas people in the top 10% have 29 tons, and in North America, it's 73 tons for the top 10%. And if you look at the top 1%, you're going to have individual emission of 100, 200 tons. So, people in the bottom 50% who have 5 tons, they're going to react very negatively to this proportional carbon tax. Basically, they will tell you, look, we can do some effort, but first you need to cut drastically, those who have emissions of 100. So you need some kind of progressive carbon tax, like the progressive income tax was introduced in the early 20th century. Okay, it's complicated, but it was also complicated to introduce a progressive income tax, but you need to do something. Otherwise, we are not going to be happy. And, they went in the street, and in the end, the carbon tax was cancelled completely. So, and nothing replaced it since then. So, it just didn't work. Yes? Yeah, so it will, in general, it will decline a little bit with your fraction of income. Yeah. So definitely, yeah, we can do that. The data, we have the data to do that, and that's exactly. So that was exactly the part of the problem from the point of view of the Yellow Vest movement, is that for them they will actually pay a larger fraction of their income. And it was worse than that in the case of the Yellow Vest movement, because in practice, it was supposed to be proportional, to be a flat tax, but in practice, you had a number of exemptions. So typically, in the European context, airplane fuel, kerosene for airplane was exempt from carbon taxation. So, people who take a plane to go for a weekend from Paris to Rome don't pay the carbon tax, and people who take their car to go to work in the Paris suburb pay the carbon tax. So, and it was even worse than that, because the tax revenue from the carbon tax was actually used to pay the repeal of the wealth tax, which was a tax on the top 1% of the population. So then people went completely crazy and started to destroy everything basically in the country. And so this was the beginning of the Macron government, and it was not a big success, to say the least. Now, you could say things could have turned differently if the tax revenue had been redistributed, and you mentioned this yesterday over dinner, if the tax revenues had been redistributed in a lump sum manner to everybody, I think this would have made it easier. I'm not sure it would have been enough, because I think, this idea of you tax everybody at the same rate, but then you redistribute lump sum, in theory it could work. In practice, there's always a big question of is the money really going to be redistributed to me later? So you know the tax you pay, but you don't necessarily know what you're going to get. And also, I think to me it will be better. You need to have an explicitly progressive tax to begin with. So you need explicitly from the beginning, to exempt the first 3 tons of carbon emission, or the first one. If you don't make it explicitly progressive from the beginning, I think there's going to be a lot of doubt in the population that they're going to be compensated. But anyway, that's this raises also issues about how you pay for international compensation and climate reparation. If it's a country-to-country transfer, some bottom groups or middle groups in the north are going to be very unhappy and probably are going to block any of this. If you have a global wealth tax or whatever taxation instrument which targets explicitly the richest people from the West or wherever they are, in order to pay for climate compensation, maybe you have a bit more chance to make it. It's going to be very complicated in any way, of course, but at least you put yourself in a position that is a bit more complicated, a bit more, maybe it's a bit more possible. So we will come back to this discussion. For now on, what I'm going to do, I have shown you the sort of snapshot of inequality today. Now I'm going to go back through time and see. So, I told you Europe used to be much more unequal 100 years ago, and we are going to try to see how things have changed over time and see whether, there are lessons to learn from this. So I'm going to show you some graph from my latest book, A Brief History of Equality, which I strongly recommend to you. This was published in 2022 in English. You can also read these 3 books if you're really interested. So, I have written 3 big books on the history of inequality. The first one was Top Incomes in France in the 20th Century, which was published in 2001, so, almost 25 years ago. I cannot believe I was already there, but yes, anyway. Then Capital in the 21st Century, which was published in 2013, and Capital and Ideology in 2019. Now, each of these books is 1,000 pages long. So this makes 3,000 pages. So, you have to be motivated. You have to have time. If you don't have the time, please read this one. This is 200 pages. And I think it's better. It's a better, well, in a sense that, it takes you time to sort of be able to synthesize your own findings. And so, this book is not perfect. It still needs to be improved. But I think it's because this is the last time the last book I wrote on this, I was able to try to concentrate on what I think are the most important findings. And also this book, I think, has a more optimistic tone maybe than the previous one. So I'm trying to insist on one important optimistic message in the long run, which is that there is, after all, despite all the setbacks and all the complications and all the difficulties, there is a long-run movement toward more equality in the very long run. So, the world today, and each country today, if you take a country like France or even the United States, is much more equal today than what it was 100 years ago before World War I. India also today, as compared to colonial British India, in many ways has more equality, more political equality, but also more socio-economic equality, more gender equality. Even though these things are still too unequal, but, as compared to 100 years ago, and as compared to 200 years ago, France 100 years ago was also more equal than France under Ancien Régime before the French Revolution. So, there is this long-run movement toward more equality, which is always very chaotic and always very complicated and involves political mobilization, social struggles, class struggles, institutional transformation. So this never happens easily. But in the end, it sort of happens, and that's the sort of optimistic perspective I'm trying to bring in this book. So this is the table of contents of the book. I'm not going to present. So it's a short book, but still it has 10 chapters. It's about 200 pages. So each chapter is about 20 pages. It's not very long, and these are always big topics. So I start with the long-run trend toward more equality, the slow deconcentration of power and property. I have long chapters on the heritage of slavery, colonialism, the question of reparation, which I will refer to a little bit today later, but not as much as I would like, because I have to cover. I'm trying to cover a lot of material, but I'd be very happy to answer any question on this. So today I'm going to focus, and particularly this morning, I'm going to focus more on what I call here the great redistribution, the big reduction in inequality between 1940 and 1980. And I'd be very happy to talk about any of the other topics that are covered in the book a bit later. So let me start with the sort of first long-run graph. So I'm going to show you some graph. I'm going to start with a few graphs on the case of France. It's not that France is a particularly interesting country, although it is in some ways. But the reason I'm showing this to you is because it's sort of very representative of Western Europe in general and of Western countries to some extent also. And also we have pretty good data for France, for income and also for wealth, because after the French Revolution, there was a system of registration of wealth, in particular at the time of inheritance, that was developed. And so we were able to go back to the archives and to study the distribution of wealth in France, going back to the French Revolution in a way that is more complicated in most other countries. So including in UK, US, you can go back to the early 20th century when modern estate tax and income tax were created in the US. You cannot go back so far in time. So that's another reason to do that. So what you can see, so this is sort of orders of magnitude for the income shares. And you can see that there is indeed a movement toward more equality, in the sense that today in France the top 10% income share will be 35%. This is after cash transfer, but before income tax and before in-kind transfer. If you were to look after income tax, after in-kind transfer, you will be more 25-30% for the top 10. So the reduction in inequality as compared to 50% until World War I will be even bigger. And for the bottom 50%, you go from 10, 12%, 13% in the 19th century, which is not so different from India today, where it will be 14, 15%, and you are at 20, 25%. Again, if you include the in-kind transfer, you will be even more than 25 to 30% for the bottom 50% share. So this is quite a substantial reduction in inequality in the long run. And as you can see, this happened mostly after World War I. Until World War I, there's not that much happening. Now, that's for the distribution of income. If you look at the same graph for the distribution of wealth, this is what you have. Now, you also have a reduction of inequality, in the sense that the blue is declining, but it is much more modest than for income. So for wealth, so here, when I talk about wealth, I talk about all assets that can be sold on an asset market. So this includes housing, this includes other forms of real estate, business assets, financial portfolio, net of debt. So this is always net wealth. What you can see is that the top 10% share, it used to be 80-90% of total wealth until roughly World War I. Then there was a big major reduction until 1980, and then it has increased a little bit. So there's been a change in trend in the 1980s, which is quite noticeable, and a slight increase in inequality since the 80s. Now today, we are still in a situation, the top 10% share will be 55 to 60% in France for wealth. So this is still a significant reduction as compared to a century ago. Now, this was mostly to the benefit of the next 40%, which I call the patrimonial middle class in my work, which today has a wealth share of about 40%. Whereas a century ago, they had a wealth share of, a little more than 10%. Now, if we look at the bottom 50%, which is the green curve, you can see that here the progress has been very limited. So basically today they have about 5% of total wealth, or 5 to 6% in France of total wealth. 100 years ago they had 2%. So okay, it's an improvement, but you are, for 50% of the population, it's not a big improvement. So the major transformation in the long run has been deconcentration of wealth from the top to the benefit of the middle class, which here I define as the people who are in between the top 10 and the bottom 50%. And so this is really a major transformation. I think we should not be, what's complicated when you talk about inequality trends is that the reality is always more complicated than what some people would like. So here, what we have on this graph is that at the same time, there's been a big improvement in the sense, a big reduction of inequality in the long run, and at the same time, you still have enormous inequality today. And the two statements, are true at the same time. And sometimes, some people want to remember only the first one or only the second one. You have to accept that the two are true at the same time, and think about it this way. So I think, it's a major transformation because, again, if we think in terms of orders of magnitude, so if you are 40% of the population, and you have about 40% of total wealth, it means that your average wealth is about the average wealth of the country. So to put numbers on this, in Western Europe today, per capita national income is going to be 35,000 euros, 40,000 euros, so say about 3,000 euros per month. That would be the average income, 35,000 euros if everybody had the same income before all tax, etc. That would be average income. Average wealth is about 5 to 6 times. So, the wealth income ratio right now in Western Europe is about 500%, 600%. So average wealth will be 200,000 euros. In Western Europe. So these people in the middle class, on average, have about 200,000 euros. So this is per adult. So we are talking of people who have anywhere between 100, 200, 300, 400,000 euros. So these people are not millionaires, they are not billionaires. And, from the point of view of a billionaire, whether you have 100 or 0 is almost the same thing. But in fact, it is not the same thing. It makes a big difference. When you have 100, 200, 300,000 euros, or, in any corresponding country, say around the sort of average wealth per capita in the country, it means typically you can own your home. Okay, maybe not in Paris, whatever, but in many parts of the country you can own a home, or you can own a little business, or maybe the two at the same time. And it makes a big difference. It's more than money. It's also a question of your bargaining power vis-à-vis your own life, vis-à-vis the rest of society. When you have zero wealth, or even worse, if you only have debt, you have very little bargaining power. Basically, you need to take any job you are being proposed, any wage, any working conditions, because you need to eat, you need to pay for your home, you need maybe to cater your family. So you are in a very weak bargaining position. You cannot make plans in life. You just have to take whatever comes. If you have 100, 200, 300,000 euros here, okay, you're not going to stop working forever, but you can pay your home, you don't need to pay your rent, or maybe you can start a little business. So this puts you in a bargaining position vis-à-vis potential employers in particular, which is a lot better, which employers maybe don't like because they would like to exploit you more easily. But from the point of view of your own life and from the point of view of society in general, I would say, this puts people on a more equal footing, and this produces, in fact, a more equal and also a more vibrant and a more dynamic society. And I think the emergence of this patrimonial middle class has been a huge improvement over time. And, 100 years ago, people at the top of the distribution, they would have said, oh, don't do that. If you try to reduce our wealth share, you're going to cut our entrepreneurial spirit, you're going to cut investment, you're going to cut economic growth. Please, please don't do that. Okay, but in the end, this is what happened through various mechanisms, which we are going to talk more later. And I think this development of this wealth middle class was very positive. And one of the questions for me for the future is, first, how do we make sure that this middle class does not disappear? And you see in France it's declining a little bit. In the US, it has declined more significantly. So I will show you numbers for the US in a minute, but the decline in the wealth share of the middle class used to be almost as large as in France, 40%, and now it's more 30%, 25%. So it's not back to 100 years ago, but it's clearly under stress, and I think this is contributing a lot to the political turmoil of the country. So that's first question, how do we make sure that we don't go back through time and we keep a strong middle class? And next question, even more important, how do you extend the middle class to the poor? So, how can you try to have a chance that the bottom 50% is also getting a share of wealth in the long run, and I will come back to the issue and talk about the question of the redistribution of inheritance a bit later. So now, for now, the question is how did we, how do you explain this evolution and this long-run evolution toward more equality? First of all, I want to make clear that I have shown you data on France, but in fact, it's quite representative of all European countries in general. So in particular, all European countries had very extreme inequality until World War I. So here I have shown you just 3 countries, France, Britain, Sweden. You can see Britain is even more unequal than France. It's funny because in my country, in France, the elite at that time, around 1900, 1910, they were always saying, oh, Britain is so unequal, aristocratic Britain as compared to us. We are a country of equals. In France, we have made the French Revolution. We got rid of aristocrats. So this was used as an argument to say 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Okay, that's good. So this was used as an argument by the French elite of the time to say we don't need an income tax. So that was the big thing. France, every country has a sort of a lot of hypocrisy and ambiguity in its own way to describe itself and to locate itself with respect to inequality. That's certainly true in India, in China, in US, everywhere. But in France, in particular, the country likes to present itself as being in love with equality since the French Revolution. But sometimes this kind of narrative, is used in a very hypocritical and self-serving manner. So in 1900, 1910, the big story among the French Republican elite was to say, we don't need an income tax because, we are a country of equals. It's not like Britain, who has enormous inequalities. They should redistribute income and wealth. But for us, we've already had the French Revolution. Except that when you look at the data, okay, there's a bit less inequality in France than in Britain, but, the concentration of wealth is really enormous. And, when I first looked at, so I discovered this data, looking at the archives of the French inheritance system in Paris and other parts of the country. And this was one of my first experience as a young researcher. And I was reading at the same time what the French economists of the time were writing, describing France as a country of equals, etc. And you think, okay, people can be really have a lot of imagination to defend the status quo and the present situation. And so this made me, this has made me change in many ways because you sort of realize, okay, we really need to check these kind of statements before being sure. And in the end, this kind of statement, sort of ideological discourse about inequality had a big impact because France indeed did not create an income tax until, France was the very last Western country to vote for income tax, and the parliament voted for it in the summer of 1914, not to pay for schools, just to pay to go to war with Germany. This was the only event that made the French Senate took away its veto power and accept to vote the tax. And another example I want to mention here, which is quite interesting, is the case of Sweden, which we look today as Sweden as a very equal country. And sometimes people say, this is the Swedish spirit, they have this egalitarian culture, maybe they're a bit crazy about equality, maybe we don't want to be like them, it's such a special culture. But in fact, this has very little to do with culture. It's all about politics and political change and institution. And in fact, if you look at Sweden 100 years ago, it was not equal at all. It was extremely unequal in a way which was, particularly unequal because, okay, in France and Britain, a big part of this extreme inequality has to do also with the colonial empire. So, the top wealth holders, a big part are colonial assets. In Britain, colonial assets make about between a quarter and 1/3 of total national wealth in Britain in 1913, and in France it's a bit less, but it's very substantial as well. And this increases the top wealth shares by a lot because the colonial assets are and foreign assets in general are concentrated in the top. In Sweden, you don't have these colonial assets, or very little, but you have something else, which is an incredibly unequal political system within Sweden.
So Sweden, listen carefully, because this is really the first time I read the history of this, I was very struck. Until 1914 in Sweden, you have a political system where, well, first, only the top 20% voters, well, top 20% male voters can vote, but that's sort of very standard for the time. What's more sophisticated is that within this top 20% in terms of property tax payments or property ownership, you would have between 1 and 100 votes, depending on how wealthy you are. So, almost like a shareholder company, except that it's, these are political elections for the parliament. And in municipal election, there was no upper ceiling on the number of votes you could get. So you had several dozen Swedish municipalities where, in fact, only one individual had more than 50% of the vote. And so was a perfectly legal dictator and could pick the mayor. And even more, in municipal elections, corporations had the right to vote, again, on the basis of their property tax payment. No, I know this seems crazy. There's a fantastic book by a Swedish historian, Erik Bengtsson, which I quote in Capital and Ideology, which I quote in my brief history of equality, which will give you all the details. He has done lots of quantitative research papers using this data. So this is not fake news, okay? This is Sweden until World War I. I mean, you had lots of imagination like this all across Europe. In Prussia, you have the famous three-tier system where you rank people by tax payment, and you take the top groups, say it will be the top 2% of the population who pay 1/3 of tax, they will have 1/3 of voting rights, and then the next third, etc. So each country was sort of inventing its own way, and in particular the elite have a lot of imagination, sometimes with their discourse in France, sometimes with the institutional system. So just returning to the case of Sweden, this was pretty extreme, as you can see. And the way it ended is through enormous political mobilization. So the trade union movement in Sweden was very strong. The working class was clearly very upset with this very unequal political system. There was enormous mobilization to get universal suffrage. And then the Social Democratic Party, which at the time was pretty revolutionary, I mean, not in the Bolshevik manner, but maybe in a more revolutionary way, in a way, because they changed the country in a sort of more sustainable and much more positive way in the long run. They took power in 1932 and put the state capacity of the country to the service of a completely different project. So basically, they use the administrative state capacities that had been built in the country to register income and wealth, but instead of distributing voting rights as a function of income and wealth, they use the registration of income and wealth to make people pay very high progressive tax on the basis of their income and wealth, to pay for a system of schools and hospitals and education and health, which is certainly not perfect. And we've seen with COVID, even in Sweden, it was complicated, and you can always improve things, but it was certainly better than everything that had existed before, and quite successful in the end. Now, and the Social Democrats have been in power basically for 70 years between 1932 and 2000, and have changed the country in a major manner. I mean, they have become less revolutionary over time. I think partly because of wrong decision in terms of completely opening the capital account, completely free capital flows, which led to a banking crisis in 1991, and which has made them much more conservative since then. But it's a long history, which I'd be happy to talk more about. But just to summarize my point here is that there's no sort of permanent cultural determinant of inequality. Some people would like to say, okay, Sweden, they are in love with equality. They've been like that forever. India is in love with inequality since the beginning of the caste system or whatever. I mean, all of this is bullshit, basically. These are all political construction which can change much more quickly than we imagine. And through political mobilization, change in institutions, these things can really change. So over the course of the 20th century, there's been a big reduction of inequality to begin with. Now, in terms of wealth concentration, you still have a sort of persistence of very concentrated wealth. So here, I show the case of Europe. So here, this is an average of Britain, France, and Sweden, but we also have other European countries which look the same way. You see the US today, so it has also declined in inequality over time, but as I told you, the middle class, this middle 40% in between the bottom 50 and the top 10, has been shrinking recently and has more, 25% of total wealth as compared to 40% in Europe. So that's, I think a danger for the future. So I said I will stop and keep 30 minutes for questions, so I guess I should stop. I covered less material than I thought, but I will do more this afternoon. Or I can continue a little bit, or let me pause. I would like to present you some of the policy transformations that can explain this reduction of inequality in the long run in Europe. So I can show you a few more slides if you're okay. Now, but if someone wants to ask a question now, that's fine also. Yeah, but please feel free again to interrupt me. So how do we account for this long-run transformation of inequality in the context of European societies? I think the first big explanation is what I call here the rise of the social state, which you could call also the welfare state. I prefer to talk about the social state because this includes education and other public services which are not always counted in welfare spending, strictly speaking. So the bottom line is, European societies before World War I had very small tax revenue, less than 10% of national income. Although, this was still probably more than many countries outside the West. And, there's a long literature showing how in the 17th and 18th century, the building of state capacity and in particular military state capacity in Europe made European states, more powerful militarily than the states in the rest of the world. And this is what made possible the process of colonial expansion. Then, until World War I, you are pretty much in the same situation, which the European state is basically concentrated on regalian matter. So basically, you have less than 10% of national income in tax revenue, and most of it is paying for police, defense. That's what the state is doing. And education and health is very, very small. In every European country, it's less than 1% of national income in 1913, or in most European countries, less than 0.5%. US is a little bit ahead as say 1% of national income versus 0.5% of national income. And then it's going to rise enormously over the course of the 20th century. And with the stabilization since the 1980s, 1990s, around 45-50% of national income for total tax revenue in Europe, in the US, around 30-35% of national income. And you can see that this big expansion of the state happened in particular through the rise of education, health, retirement, pension spending, and other social transfer. So if you take the example of education, this is a typical example of a spending that is going to bring more equality. So basically, you start from a very elitist education system in 1914, and you move to a system with universal or quasi-universal access first to primary schools and to secondary school, and at the end of the period, you have a majority of the population of a generation going to university. And we will come back to this this afternoon, and we will see that there's still a lot of inequality in access to education, but in the long run, there's been enormous improvement, and so this has reduced inequality, and at the same time, this has contributed to increase productivity and to foster economic growth and economic prosperity. And this also came together with the rise of progressive taxation. So here, this is on this graph, you have a simple summary of the history of progressive income tax in a number of Western countries. So you can see that the US and Britain have experimented very, very high top marginal tax rate in the middle of the 20th century. So you can see first that before World War I, there was very little. Well, in France, it was zero until 1914. This is what I told you before. The other countries had introduced their income tax a little before. It was getting big in a country like Japan. But in most countries, the tax progressivity really increased a lot after World War I. Particularly in the US. So, you know, in the US, the US at the time was very concerned with inequality. You know, you have this famous speech by Irving Fisher, who was the president of the American Economic Association in 1919, where he would tell his fellow American economists, you know, the big danger for America today is inequality. You know, we are getting almost as unequal as Europe, which was viewed at the time as the temple of inequality from an American spirit. We need to do something, and we need to have very progressive taxation, and that's what they did already in the 20s, and even more so under Roosevelt in the 30s. On average, between 1930 and 1980, the top income tax rate for the federal income tax in the US was 81%, and this is only so sometimes it was 90, sometimes 70, on average it was 81, and it was not for a few years, it was for half a century, and this was only the federal income tax. You also have state income tax with tax rate of 5 to 10%, depending on the state. Now, apparently, you know, this did not destroy American capitalism. You know, otherwise we would have noticed it. In fact, this was the period of maximum prosperity of the U.S. economy. In particular, this was the period with the gap with the rest of the world in terms of productivity was the highest, if possible. You know, and so I know it's sometimes it's complicated to have this discussion, because when we get about taxation, people get very excited and shout and disagree, and that's fine. We should have this discussion. We should have this disagreement. All I want to say is that we should, in this discussion, we should take into account this historical legacy and the fact that, you know, this very high progressive tax rate in the past, I think, you know, were quite well. You know, if we go back through time, you know, they were reduced enormously in the 1980s. So you can see the Reagan and Thatcher tax reform in the 1980s, which reduced enormously this tax rate. But, you know, the question is, has it been successful? And you know, this was supposed to, you know, the state, what Reagan in the 1980s told the U.S. Citizenry was, okay, we are going to reduce progressive taxation, we're going to reduce top tax rate, maybe inequality is going to increase, but, you know, the size of the pie is going to rise so fast that everybody is going to gain. You know, average income, average wages are going to grow like you've never seen, and therefore, you know, rising inequality is not going to be a problem, and you're all going to be happy. The problem is that growth was not boosted by this reform. And so if you look, so this is the evolution of growth in the US over this time period. And so in red, you have the average top income tax rate, which was divided by 2. But growth was also divided by 2, in fact. By the way, I'm not saying that. So this is the growth rate, you know, of the annual growth rate of per capita national income in the US. And in 1990 to 2020, it was a little more than 1% as compared to 2% in the previous period. I'm not saying that the reduction of the growth rate is due to the reduction of the top income tax rate. I think it has more to do with the stagnation of educational investment, the fact that the US used to be really educational leader and had a lot of advance in education in the middle of the 20th century over Europe. You know, in the 1950s, 1960s, you already have 80% of a generation going to high school in the US, whereas in Germany, France, Japan, it's only 20-30% at the time. By the 1980s, 1990s, European countries and Japan have catch up with the US in terms of education, and the total educational investment in the US is not, as a fraction of national income, is not rising anymore. So you still have very top universities in the US, but, you know, the rest of the country, and you know, there's a lot of inequality in the educational system. And in the end, I think this is probably the main explanation for the growth slowdown and productivity growth slowdown in the US and in Europe, and you know, education is really the key for everything here. But, you know, in any case, what we should all be able to agree is that reducing the top income tax rate in itself is not sufficient to boost, innovation or economic growth. And, this major Reagan experiment in policy, I think, was a failure in the sense that, this was based on a promise to boost economic growth, which simply did not work. And I think this is one of the main explanations for many of the political complications that we see today in the US. In particular, the transformation of the Republican Party in the US has a lot to do with this failure. So in the 1980s, the Republican Party was sort of very optimistic about globalization, economic growth, and Reagan would tell the country, okay, we cut tax, your income and wages are going to grow like crazy, you're all going to be happy. And 30 years later, in fact, American, the median income of US household did not increase like crazy. It sort of stagnated. You had the 2008 financial crisis, the mortgage crisis, a rise of household debt. So people feel that this has not worked very well. And so the Republican Party changed completely its discourse and basically, blaming globalization and saying, that's because you have worked hard, but you didn't get the reward to your work because the rest of the world, China, Europe, Mexico, India, whatever, everybody in the rest of the world has sort of stolen your money from you, and we're gonna change this. And sometimes it's a bit scary to be honest, but I think it's this is to some extent the consequence of the failure of this experiment. Okay, so now let me stop there and take questions about this material, and we will continue this afternoon. So how much time do we have? No time at all? 10 minutes. 10 minutes, okay. So sorry, you should interrupt me, otherwise I keep talking. That's bad. So, yes, someone over there?
Hi, Dr. Piketty. I'm Bishma, and I'm a master's student from Shivnada University. I have a very simple question. There's a global transitioning towards automation and, introduction of artificial intelligence. How do you think this is going to exacerbate or mitigate global inequality across developing or developed nations? Or to be more specific, how is it going to affect the heterogeneous economic classes of these countries?
I think at this stage, one could say it's too early to say, but I want to say a bit more than that. No, I think at this stage, from what we see, it's really likely to exacerbate inequality, because the way the artificial intelligence is organized right now as an economic sector is a sort of caricature, to me, of sort of private appropriation of, public knowledge of basically of the work of others, So you have people who have written journal articles, who have written books, who have done stuff, and then you have some other people who are going to, do this algorithm to try to use all this knowledge in a way that is not necessarily very reliable, and without acknowledging what knowledge they use, and then they tell you, we cannot tell you exactly what we used because this is too complicated for you to understand. So they manage to convince government that they will have the right to use all of this knowledge without saying which knowledge they use and recognizing. So to me, this looks like really a caricature of creating some new private property rights over things which should be public or should have a much more widespread distribution of property rights. Now, in principle, you could have another organization of artificial intelligence where we would recognize the existence of these different stakeholders and property rights and sort of a much less sort of capitalist organization of the sector. But this will require strong political mobilization, strong government to regulate this, which you don't quite see at this stage.
I think as a chair, can I ask you a question, or do I go last? Okay, I go last.
Maybe.
So,
yeah.
Yes. We can pool in the questions, and then you can go ahead.
Hi. So I have two questions, and they're sort of related.
Can you ask just one, please?
Oh, okay. I'll jump to the one that's better. So this is in context to the chart you showed regarding emissions. So we clearly know that the global north emits way more than the global south. And recently at COP29 in Baku, we saw India reject the climate finance deal that offered just 300 billion as opposed to the 1.3 trillion that global south asked for to deal with climate crisis. And it is in the global south that the most vulnerable people are in and the people who would be most affected by the climate crisis. But we cannot really wage a class war within the global kind of context, right, which you advocate for within a country. So in that context, how does the global south and like how does India kind of get the developed countries to pay their fair share?
Maybe on the right now, on the left or the right?
A very good morning, sir. My name is Chitralekha. I'm from Center for International Trade and Development, GNU. And sir, actually I have a few questions, but I'll ask one which is more relevant in India's context. Actually two, sir, if you allow me.
No, we don't allow it.
Oh, sorry.
Let's not get greedy.
So you said that education, government's role in investing in education has been a major reason why there has been this kind of an effect. So sir, in India's context, we see that education, there has been, I mean, investment from the government side might have been lower, but we do have an educated class, but we don't have enough employment for the people here. So how do you think, if even if the government invests, is there any scope that they would be absorbed in the workforce and we will observe a growth potential there? So maybe if the government is even investing,
I think you got the question.
Thank you, thank you.
Just one more question and then
Well, I think there are at least two more or three more, yeah.
Good
more
morning,
questions.
sir. My name is Amisha. So when we talk about the rising economic inequality within the countries, on the other side, we also think about the ways to reduce it on the parallel side. So in regard to that, some researchers stands in the favor of wealth tax as a way to reduce the economic inequality, while some oppose it. So I would like to hear your take on that. So thank you.
Hello, Professor Piketty. My name is Arya, and I'm a final year undergrad from the Gokhale Institute. In a lot of countries with a lot of inequality, money is power, and the top income, I mean, the top rich people, they have no incentive to improve the conditions of the poor because keeping the poor helps them, gain votes during the election using freebies and very short-term incentives. So how do you propose to change this incentive structure? Because clearly the voters' preferences are not being displayed in elections, apart from shooting CEOs. So how would we go about doing that?
Okay, shall I answer?
please.
Yeah, regarding shooting CEOs, what matters is to have a minimum of organization. So, you cannot do it alone. That's the important thing. So it's better if this is collectively organized. And, no, but more seriously, the good news is that in history, revolution do happen and, political mobilization do happen. And what's perfectly clear is that you cannot expect, the people, say, who don't pay tax to suddenly say, okay, I want to pay tax. So, in at the time of the French Revolution, you would not expect the aristocrat to suddenly say, okay, we are going to change the tax system. And so, there was a mobilization and we changed the system. And I think this is the same today with the billionaire. And so the question of the wealth tax that was asked, is the wealth tax useful? Yeah, I think this is the only way to get the very top of the distribution and the top wealth holders to pay a decent rate of tax. The income tax is not going to be sufficient because, well, there are several reasons. You know, the first, there's a sort of technical reason, but which is important, which is that the reported income by top billionaire is a ridiculously small fraction of their wealth. And Ram Singh has done some very interesting work on this using the report by candidate in Indian elections who have to report their income and wealth. And, you know, the ratio between income and wealth, you know, it falls to very low level for very high wealth people. But that's something that you find not only in India, but in every country. And if you look at the really very, very top billionaire, you know, in the US, there was a publication by ProPublica who was able to access the income tax declaration of you know, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, etc. And the conclusion was that over the past 10 years, the total income tax paid by the top US billionaires was like less than 1% of their wealth over 10 years. So they managed to report taxable income that is 0.01% of their wealth every year. So, you know, even if you tax it at 90%, like Roosevelt did, that's not going to do anything because their income is very small. So you have to tax the wealth itself. And also that's the only way to redistribute wealth itself. So even if income was perfectly well reported, I think there are also reasons why you want to supplement the progressive income tax with a progressive wealth tax and a progressive inheritance tax. But in practice, I think the annual progressive wealth tax is a lot more important and promising in terms of tax revenues than the progressive inheritance tax. Now, how is this going to happen? You know, I think this will happen through, yes, class war, political mobilization, just like it happened in the past many times already. So it's always complicated, but, you know, it has happened many times in the past. It will happen again. Now, this brings me to the question someone asked, but what about at the international level? Because how are we going to have a class war at the international level? That's impossible. So how are we going to get the 1.3 trillion climate reparation rather than 300 billions, which I'm not even sure, you know, the North is going to pay. They will call it transfer, but it will still be controlled by them. So how are we going to get to significant amount? And let me say, by the way, that the 1.3 trillion is still you know, much less than what we should have. You know, just to get, because these numbers are always impressive when you express them in dollars, in trillions, billions, etc. But you need to express them as a percentage of the world GDP. You know, world GDP is more than 100 trillion in dollars, now 130 or 100. So this is this 1.3 trillion is less than 1% of the world GDP. So the idea that you can solve climate change, you know, just with 1% of world GDP is wrong. You know, it will have to be 5%, 10%. It will have to be even bigger amounts in the long run if we want to be serious about it. But in any case, that will be much better than the 300. Now, how are we going to have an international class war to do that? I think, you know, it's complicated, but it's not impossible. I mean, there are different ways, you know, the international class war is taking place. You know, there is war. You know, that's unfortunately this is the way it takes place. But you know, I think it can also take place through trade sanction, trade relation, and to begin with, you need to have a coalition of countries. And I think this is where. You know, I would have liked India, you know, to play a much more active role in the proposal by Brazil to push for a minimum billionaire tax in the G20 summit. And I think, you know, just to stop a little bit on this, the fact that the possibility of a global tax on billionaires is adopted by G20 countries. I mean, the very fact that it was discussed this year in 2024 is a very interesting development. And you know, 10 years ago, I wrote Capital in the 21st Century. I proposed to have a global wealth tax, but, you know, everybody and, you know, all the economics profession in particular was laughing at me and saying, you know, this will never happen. This is ridiculous. And you know, the fact that we have 10 years later a discussion in G20, you know, make me you know, happy, of course, and I think this shows that, you know, things can change. And the other interesting news is that this came from the global south. You know, this didn't come from Europe or from US, or this came from Brazil, because I think, you know, the countries in the global south have a lot potentially to gain, and I think they have a lot of legitimacy also both because of post-colonial reparation and because of climate reparation, and the two, in the 21st century are going to play a role together. And I think, the global wealth tax is a way to address this. And don't be wrong, the reason why European governments officially were not against it. We are not really pushing for it, but they could not. It's interesting that for their public opinion, they couldn't say, I am against it. I mean, if you ask for a transfer from the French budget to the climate fund, then the French government is going to say, no way, my French taxpayers are poor, they cannot pay. If it's a billionaire tax, it's more difficult to say you are against it. So they were sort of neutral. The real player who was against it was the US government, and the reason the US government was against it is because they understood that it will be not only a minimum billionaire tax where India will tax India's billionaire, US will tax US billionaire, but there will also be some international transfer. And it was not completely explicit in the Brazilian proposal, but given the discussion on the climate fund and how you pay for climate fund, it's absolutely clear for everybody that once you introduce the tool of a minimum billionaire tax, you're going to use a 1% tax rate component to pay for the climate fund. And this, for US, was completely unacceptable. But I think in the long run, this is what will happen. And in order to make this happen, I think India, is going to be key. And I think, with maybe India with a different government, I don't know, but, it will be key because, given the size of India, given the importance of India in the democratic scene, and I think if there was a coalition of all, democracies in the global south, and, well, as many countries as possible, whatever their political regime in the global south, to push for this, it will become very difficult at some point for the global north to resist this. And if they were to resist this, then, you can have trade sanctions. And, as time passes, the economies in the global south are going to get bigger and bigger. And so, I think, this is going to happen. And now I have to stop because we are.
Yes, you have to stop now.
We have well over time. Okay.
No, I think. Can I ask a last question?
Except that I did not answer the one on education and employment. So if I answer you, I have to answer the other one first.
No, I think it's been an excellent presentation. When I came to Delhi school, I don't remember whether it was in Delhi school or Bharat told me in ISI. He told me of a law about economists, which is, to every economist, there's an equal and an opposite economist. That's the first law. And the second law is both of them are wrong. But having said that, I think Professor Piketty is an exception, maybe. We will accept what he says about global inequality, even though there is a counter to the estimates as far as the US global estimates are concerned about inequality. But having said that, I think, where I'm in a slight disagreement with you is in the last slide when you talked about education. If you look at the US productivity growth in the 1950s and 60s, the average labor productivity growth was around 4%. And it declined in the 2000 to less than 1% now. And that's a really troubling sign because the share of labor or the share of wages is getting affected, which is also driving a large part of inequality. But there's a very recent paper that came out in the NBR which showed that perhaps what is driving this is increased investment into universities and research, which has completely crowded out the corporate R&D. So the thinkers and doers that were sort of introducing new technology, innovations, that rate has declined, and interestingly, they actually establish in a causal way. There's the funding in the universities, the public research, which was supposed to complement private inventions and innovations, has had just the opposite impact. So now, in some sense, what the research is highlighting is a more nuanced sort of an argument, whereas what you had talked about, that education has become expensive. And education, I agree, has become expensive, and this is a conversation I had with Baumol, actually, interestingly, when I was doing my PhD, where he said, basically he commented, essentially, that I don't know why they teach growth in a macro. Growth should be taught in the micro courses. It's a micro concept, not a macro concept. And he reminded me of, he wrote a paper where he talked about inequality in growth rates, that there are intersectoral variations in growth rates, and that term is now known as the Baumol cost disease, that if sectors grow at different rates, then the labor-intensive sectors, because of no productivity growth, will become more expensive, which is basically health, education, which are far more labor-intensive. So
do you have one question or two questions?
no, I don't have. I have two. I have a question that it sort of challenges, in some sense, your public, your
Okay,
education
it's
aspect.
more like a statement than a question, but can I answer?
Yes.
Good. So, in part of the answer is this, which is that, so this is access to university in the US as a function of parental income. So this is data gathered by my friends and colleague Raj Shetty and Emmanuel Saez at Berkeley and Harvard University. So they were able to match the social security numbers of the students with the tax information of the parents. And so when you rank students by percentile of parental income and the rate of access to higher education, this is what you get. So this is almost the 45-degree line. So not quite. If your parents are poor, you still have a 25% chance to go to university, and if your parents are rich, you only have a 95% chance to go to university. So it's not exactly the 45-degree line. And now this is understating inequality in access, because in fact the universities you go to when your parents are rich over there are not the same at all. So what I'm saying is that the idea that there is excessive public resources in education and higher education in particular, to me is not really convincing. I think there's been a lot of progress in education, in the sense that today everybody access primary, secondary education in the US at least, and the issue is really higher education. But in terms of access to higher education, I think this cannot be great for productivity growth and for the. I don't think this is the best we can do. And I think the fact that there was a stagnation. If you look at total education investment, this is what I've shown you here. So this was for Europe, but in fact you have the same for the US. You can see total education investment since the 1980s, 1990s has sort of stagnated around 6% of national income, and it had been multiplied by 10 over the course of the 20th century. It was 0.5% of national income. It went to 6% of national income, and then it stagnates. And I don't know, but you can see how in an endogenous growth model, if you have this big rise in educational investment and then a stagnation, how this can, it will be very strange if it does not contribute to the growth slowdown. Now, private R&D can also be very useful and very important, but I stick to the idea that we can make progress in access to higher education, including in the US. And now. And this brings me to the question I did not answer, which is that education itself does not create a job. And then you have the issue of capital investment, capital equipment, sectoral specialization, and trade policy can also contribute to this. And, historically, this has been very important. The rich countries today, pretend they are in favor of free trade, while sometimes in the US they go back to the protectionist discourse, which in fact was the protectionist practice in the 19th century pretty much everywhere. And, the US developed, in particular between 1870 and 1940 with huge tariffs to protect its manufacturing sector at the time. And the development is always a combination of industrial strategy, sectoral specialization, right capital investment, and education. And, education alone, as you're right, does not in itself create the jobs we want.
Thank you very much, Professor Piketty. That was a very, very enriching conversation. Thank you very much. The parallel sessions will start on time. So I think that was the administrative announcement. Thank you very much. Highly appreciate your time.
Thank you. I should look at this paper.
This is Ashish Arora, federal tax, but think you're confusing education research is what he's talking about. And the education cost I was saying was this formal cost disease, that education is a very labor-intensive sector. So growth in other sectors can cause education to become more.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the next plenary talk of the day. We are honored to have with us Professor Thomas Piketty. Professor Thomas Piketty is Professor of Economics and Economic History at EHESS and at the Paris School of Economics. Our esteemed chair for the session is Professor Pulin B. Nayak, former Professor and Director DSE. Now I request Professor Pulin B. Nayak and Professor Thomas Piketty to kindly take their seats on the dais. Professor Nayak's research focuses on public finance and economic development. His work reflects a deep understanding of the interplay between economic theory and practical policy challenges. Now I request Professor Pulin B. Nayak to take the session further. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. Friends, we are extremely fortunate and honored to have with us Professor Thomas Piketty, who is going to speak on global inequality and redistribution, education, reparations, and political cleavages. I don't think it will be an exaggeration to say that in the last decade, Thomas Piketty has come into the scene of economic research in a very major way. His work on inequality has been extensive, and starting with the book Capital in the 21st Century, Capital and Ideology, then a brief history of equality, he has established his expertise both in terms of the theory as well as the empirics of the issue of inequality. I have had occasion to look through his book on equality. It's a major book, and one of the things I might say, I don't know whether he'll agree, is that he has a positive and constructive way of looking at the issue of inequality. Anyone who is a student of Marx would know that capitalism, the chief difficulty and major problem with capitalism is the continuation of inequality, and it becomes so extreme that there is an implosion. The system implodes and it cannot sustain itself any longer. But if you read the works of Piketty, at least that's the way I have tried to understand him, he sees that there is a way out of this possible problem. There is a constructive way in which we can think in terms of looking at the issue of inequality, looking at progressive income tax, looking at taxation of wealth, looking at inheritance tax, and other ways of looking at this entire problem. So I will not take any more time, and I request Thomas Piketty to take the stage.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we are going to continue what we started this morning, and I'm going to focus on a number of issues related to education, reparation. Well, we started to have this discussion, especially in the question after this morning's talk, and mostly today I will this afternoon I will talk about the political cleavage dimension when it comes to inequality. So let me, let me summarize. I'm just going to go directly where we were. What I argued this morning is that the reduction of inequality, especially in Western countries over the course of the 20th century, went through, came from the rise of the welfare state, the rise of the social state, in particular the rise of education spending, and also the rise of progressive taxation. And so this is, this brief history of progressive taxation that we talked about this morning. And what I have argued, these two major transformations of capitalism typically were not foreseen by Marx. I mean, it was very difficult writing in the 1860s to guess that we will have
this kind of transformation in the 20th century. But this is a major transformation. I don't know what he would have thought of it, but in any case, this is a major transformation of modern societies. And, it also means that the kind of capitalist system that you have at the end of the period, with half of national income being socialized in effect through taxation, has very little to do with the one you had 1 century before, with less than 10% in tax revenue, mostly used for police force, army, colonial expansion. So it's also a very different kind of state power and a very different kind of state capacity that you have, back at the time of Karl Marx and until today. And so that's a major transformation. And the rise of progressive taxation with top tax rate that went as high as 80, 90, sometimes even more than 90%, is also a major transformation which contributed a lot to reduce inequality over time. Now, the question I want to ask is more about the future and how this is, first of all, how can we do better in the future? How can we reduce inequality even more in the 21st century that was done in the 20th century, and ideally also at a more global perspective, because at the end of the day, the rise of the social state was very much something that happened in the nation states, in the rich nation states of Europe, to a lesser extent in North America. And this really did not really take place in a context of global redistribution. So in order to go beyond this, the first thing is to keep expanding the social state, and the spendings in health and education are going to keep rising in the 21st century. And if you don't put more public resources into it, then it will be private resources, and it's not clear at all whether it will be more efficient or, in any meaningful manner. So, many people in the West now say we should stabilize this level of tax revenue as a percentage of national income forever. Nobody wants to return to 1 century ago. That's at least one good thing, is that, there's a sort of consensus in Western societies. No meaningful political force is saying, okay, we should go back to less than 10% of national income. So at least, the sort of political, intellectual, and cultural battle has been won for this, in the sense that this has become sort of a consensus that you should at least remain at this level. Then some people would like to go further, and I share this view. Some people say we should just stabilize everything forever at this level. I understand this point of view, but at the same time, what I want to say is that, spending in education, health, but also culture, energy, transportation, lots of public infrastructure are going to keep rising. And if you want to do it only with private funding and with a for-profit logic, it's not clear at all that it's going to work well. And if you take the example of the health sector, in European countries, health sectors is about 10% of national income. So this is the public component. If you add private spending, you are like 12, 13% of national income. In the US, where it is mostly private, where more than half of the total spending is private, total spending in health is now close to 20% of national income. We used to say, okay, health in the US is very expensive, it's 10, 15%. Well, now it's still rising. Now it's 18% of GDP in the latest figures. It's going toward 20%. Is this working well? No, it's not working well. They spend 20% instead of 12 in Europe, and they have a much lower life expectancy, and this is falling. So, this is good for pharmaceutical companies, for doctors who are paid very well, but in terms of public health, it's not clear at all whether this is good. So, doing it through the private sector, in practice, can mean that it's going to be very costly. So US taxpayers, okay, maybe they pay less tax, but they pay so much more in insurance premium that in the end, this is more costly for them. And in terms of health outcome, it does not work so well. So, this is the discussion of the future. I'm not saying easy to raise permanently the level of taxation, but at the same time, the private sector also has a cost, and sometimes the cost of the private sector can be higher than the cost of the public sector in many areas. So that's going to be, this is a very difficult discussion for the future. There's also, of course, the issue of the return of progressive taxation, which has been severely reduced since the Reagan decade. And I argued this morning that this was a failure in the sense that the productivity boost and growth boost that was announced by Reagan did not materialize. But still, this doesn't mean that it's easy to restore tax progressivity and to impose more tax progressivity. So there's all the discussion we discussed a little bit this morning about the global wealth tax, which I think is very important. And, I think it's possible to go in this direction. But, this will again involve major political battles and political mobilization. Something else I would like to say is that if we, remember this morning, I have shown you that there's been a movement toward more equality of income in the long run, an incomplete movement, but still a movement toward more equality of income. In terms of equality of wealth, the movement has been more limited. There's been the rise of a sort of patrimonial wealth middle class, but the bottom 50% basically is still getting nothing in wealth. So if we're asking in the long term, how can you change this? Well, in my view, maybe the only way, or one of the only ways to really change this will be to redistribute inheritance itself. So here, this is a simple simulation which was done for Europe, but it could work for India or for any part of the world as well. We start from the current situation where the inheritance is extremely concentrated. So basically, these are the numbers for Europe, where the bottom 50% of children receive about 5% of total inheritance, and the top 10% of children receive 55% of inheritance. In India, it will be even a bit worse. The top 10% of children maybe would have 65% or a bit more of inheritance, but it's more unequal, but in both cases, it's very unequal. So that's the current situation. And then here you have what you would get if you had a system of redistribution of inheritance which would work this way, which is that everybody at age 25 would get 60% of average inheritance. So in the context of Europe, where average inheritance, average wealth per adult is now of the order of 200,000 euros in per adult terms, everybody would receive 120,000 euros at age 25. Now, let me make clear that this will come, in my view, this will come in addition to the welfare state, to the social state. This should not replace education. This should not replace basic income. So you have a system of basic income that is in place in most Western European countries. The problem with basic income is that it's very basic. It's typically it's going to be half of the minimum full-time minimum wage. So it's more like a poverty, something to avoid complete poverty. That's very important, of course, but that does not give you as much bargaining power over your life that if you have basic wealth. This morning I tried to explain that the fact of having in a European context 100, 200, 300,000 euros to be able to buy a home or to start a business give you more bargaining power in your life, in a way that the basic income is not enough to give you this. So, this redistribution of inheritance, in my view, will come on the top of every existing social transfer. This will be paid for by progressive taxation of inheritance for top inheritance, and also progressive taxation of wealth, of high wealth. The total cost of this, so if you want to redistribute this to everybody at age 25, this minimum inheritance equal to 60% of average wealth in your country, that's going to cost you about 5% of national income each year, which is a lot of money. But at the same time, if in the long run the size of government has gone from 10% to 50% of national income, 5% of national income, an additional 5% of national income is not something completely crazy to think about in the longer run. So I'm not saying this is going to happen next week or next year or whatever, but I'm just saying if we're thinking of new targets for social democratic societies and social democracy or democratic socialism, as I prefer to call it, in the 21st century, then you have to think of something like this. And let me make clear. Right now, we are in a situation where the bottom 50% receive zero. The top 10% in Western European context receives on average 1.2 million euro, and you have some people who receive dozens of millions or hundreds of millions. After the reform, everybody would receive 120,000. So people who were at zero go from 0 to 120,000 at age 25. People who were at 1.2 million on average, the top 10%, they will still be at 600 or 700,000. So there will still be a big gap between the bottom 50% children and the top 10% children. And if you want my opinion, I think we could go even beyond that. But what's very interesting in this discussion is that when you make this kind of proposal, you immediately face very big critics of people asking. But, all these poor children, bottom 50% children, what are they going to do with the money? They're going to make maybe stupid things with the money. As if wealthy children were always doing clever things with the inheritance they receive. This is... So, it's a... By the way, I have no problem with putting constraint with what you do with the money. Maybe this has to be tight with buying a home, starting a business, whatever you want. But then it should also be the same constraint for wealthy children. It's not clear. Because you see in this discussion, there is a sort of mythology that everybody is in favor of equality of opportunity. These are our common values. We all want equal opportunities. But then when we start to have a concrete discussion about making opportunities a bit more equal with redistribution of inheritance, it's sort of the obvious way to make a bit more equal opportunities, then people get crazy and say, oh, but these poor children, they will make stupid things. And you realize that the supposed belief in favor of equal opportunities is in fact a very elitist set of beliefs, and in fact many people pretend they are in favor of that, but in fact they want more opportunities for certain groups of the population than others. And again, this will be only a mild reduction of inequality of opportunity, and we should go much beyond that. Okay, I'm not saying this is going to happen anytime soon. I'm just saying that if you don't do something like that, it's likely that the extreme concentration of wealth that we've seen earlier, will continue in the future. Because the idea that we should just wait for growth and market competition to spread the wealth, it's a very nice idea from a theoretical level. But what we've seen in history is that, we've had growth for 200 years, we've had huge, and the share of the bottom 50% in wealth is still 5% unless, and the bottom 50% children don't receive anything. So you can wait 200 more years if you want, but, that's probably not going to work. I mean, you can also say that this is the best we can do, that, if you try to redistribute this, the economy is going to stop working, and the sky is going to fall and everything. You can say that, except that this is already what people were saying 100 years ago, before there was a big redistribution towards the middle 40%, and if anything, this, the sky didn't fall, and it actually contributed in the long run to a more vibrant economy with more people being able to invest, buy a home, start a business. And I think it will be the same, in a society where the bottom 50% would have a sizable fraction of wealth. Because when you have 35% of total wealth as the bottom 50%, okay, you are poorer than average, but you are not ridiculously poor. You have a say, because wealth is about power. Wealth is about opportunities and taking time before accepting a job offer and negotiating your wage, negotiating your life in general. So I think this will contribute to make a more vibrant society. The other way to go in this direction, which I think is very much complementary, is also to change the rules of the game of capitalism, in the sense of changing the relation between capital, power, voting rights, and having more economic democracy, including, of course, in firms and corporations. So one way to do that is to follow the what has been done in a number of countries. So in countries like Germany or Sweden, you have up to 50% of voting rights in the board of corporation, which go to worker representative. Which means in large companies in Germany, you have 50% of the voting rights for worker representative. Now shareholders always have the decisive vote, so they have 50% plus one for shareholders. Now that's in the situation where the workers don't have any share in the capital, because the 50% of voting rights they get, it's only as workers. If in addition workers have 20% stake in the capital, or if a local government or regional government, which often happens in Germany, has a 20% stake in the capital of the company. So, for instance, the regional state of Western Westphalia has 20% of Volkswagen in Germany. Then, together with the 50% voting rights for workers, it means you change the majority and you turn the majority, including against a shareholder who has 80% of the capital of the company. And I can tell you that from the point of view of shareholders, this is like communism. This is, how is it possible that I have 80% of the shares and I don't have the majority of the vote? But this is West Germany since 1952. And apparently, like Roosevelt 90% tax, this did not destroy German capitalism. And, if anything, all the evidence we have is that this contributed to involve labor unions, workers in the long-run strategy of company in a positive manner. And, in my country, so unfortunately, this has not been extended to other countries. Not, in my country, in France or in Britain or in the US, you don't have these rules, and only shareholders can have 100% of voting rights. In France, 10 years ago, there was one seat that was introduced out of 15 in the board of, but it's very small. It's not 50%. And for a long time in my country, in France, shareholders were saying, "Oh, but we don't want workers on boards of our company. We want workers to go in the street and demonstrate and protest, but we don't want to have them in our boardrooms and open our book accounts to them. They are not able to do that." And then more and more, people are telling French shareholders, "Well, look, this is what happens in Germany. This is what happens in Sweden. After all, this doesn't work so bad." And I think at some point this will spread to other countries. Now you could do more than this, and so this is what I call participatory socialism, where basically the voting rights held by a single shareholder will shrink with the size of the company. So that, for instance, if you have a company more than 100 employees, you would have only 10% of voting rights, even if you are the single shareholder. So it's a way for very small companies, you will still keep the majority of voting rights, but as the company gets bigger, even if you're a single shareholder, you don't have 50% of the vote, you have more, you have 10% of the vote. So this is, a continuation of the sort of German, Swedish co-management model. What's the rationale for this is that you want, especially in a large organization, you want people to discuss, you want people to share power. And, the idea is that because a single individual at some point in time, had a good idea or was very lucky or both at the same time, that this individual should keep 100% of the decision-making power for the rest of his life, until age 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, including if the organization has become incredibly large and there are incredibly decisions to be made. This view of economic decision-making, is a sort of, looks to me like a sort of monarchical view of power, which doesn't fit with a society where you have so many educated persons, so many engineers, managers, technicians with a higher education degree. And so, I think to me there are really serious chances that we move in this direction. I think first the German-Swedish model is now being discussed in France, in Britain, in US in ways that were not discussed a few decades ago. I think partly because also the political parties like Socialist Party in France or Labour Party in Britain, which until the 80s were pushing for full nationalization, and were not so interested in the German co-management model are now moving, have moved actually for a long time toward co-management model. And also, you've also seen in recent years sometimes some conservative political parties, like Liz Truss in Britain wanted to introduce some German co-management system. She had to step down because of Brexit before she could do anything, but she was pushing for that, which was very striking to me, why a conservative politician would do that. But what you could see in her speeches is that it was also a way to do some kind of social inclusive policy which does not cost you anything, because it does not cost you any tax money, like when you raise the minimum wage, for instance. So this is, I'm not sure this is the best reason to focus on these policies, that it doesn't cost you anything, but that can be one practical reason also why this can become popular. Now, I want to move now to the issue of education, because that's probably the most important one in the history of equality that I tell in my book. Redistribution of wealth, redistribution of power is absolutely important, but better distribution of education is even more important. And I want to step back a little bit in history and show you that, the inequality and the stratification in an education system is really sort of the key ingredient which can make extreme inequality persist in a society. And on the contrary, if you democratize education, this is really the key ingredient that can lead us toward more equality. So let me show you, compare a colonial setting. So here I am comparing a 3 time period for France and for France 1910, France 2020, and Algeria 1950, which was at the time French colonial Algeria, as an example of extreme inequality of educational resources. And so, I've not done the same computation for India, for colonial India, or for other colonial societies, but I think it will look probably quite extreme like this. So what do you have on this graph? Here, what I look at is I look for a given generation of children. I look at the children who receive the most educational resources, typically those who go to university as compared to those who go to primary school, or within primary school, within secondary school, if you have unequal schools and sometimes segregated schools, who are the children who are getting the most resources and what share of the resources they get. So it's a simple indicator of educational inequality. And so what you can see is that in Algeria in 1950, 10% of the children are getting 80% of the school resources. Who are these children? Well, these are the children of the settlers. You have about 10% of the population in colonial Algeria who are the French settler population, which is quite a big share for the colonizers. Usually in most French colonies in Africa, you have less than 1, in fact, less than 0.1%. In British India, the share of British settlers was like 0.1 or 0.2% of the population, very, very small. So, controlling a country with 0.1, 0.2% of the population implies, of course, that you need to make a lot of alliance with the local elite, and that's a complicated story that you all know well, and that we could spend a lot of time talking about. Colonial Algeria is a different setting where you have a significant white settler population, 10% of the population. It's sort of comparable to South Africa, where you have 10-15% of white, so they are a minority, but it's a big minority, and they are completely controlling the country. And in particular, they have a completely segregated school system. So the way it will work in French colonial Algeria is that you would have school, including primary school for the children of the settlers, and schools for the children of the so-called Muslim Algerian at the time, the rest of the population. And if you look at the school budget, so this is research that was done in colonial archives with a number of colonial historians in France, including Denis Cognot, Sandrine Mélé-Comte, and what they have done is really to go in the official budget of colonial Algeria, because at the time this was completely public. This was not thought to be scandalous in any way. This was the way the colonial system would work. And they have looked at the budget of the different schools, and basically, the children for the white settlers were getting budgets that were so big that with the 10% of the population, they will get 80% of the budget, which is completely crazy when you think of it, but this is the way it works. Now, when you have such, and I should say also the tax revenue was coming from the local tax base in Algeria and was mostly indirect taxation, very regressive taxation, consumption tax falling on the poorest and middle group. So in effect, the colonized were paying tax in order to pay, school system for the children of the colonizers, to simplify, which is, this is the way it worked. And now you can make extreme inequality between different groups of the population very persistent with this kind of mechanism. It's important to have in mind because, sometimes in my country, in France, when you talk about racial segregation, for instance, you talk about, Black Lives Matter in the US, etc. You have people in France who say, oh, but this is the US, we have nothing to do with racial segregation. There's never been any racial segregation in France, except that if you look on the other side of the Mediterranean, within the French colonial empire in Algeria, you have extreme racial segregation until the very end of the colony. So this is in the 1950s and until the end of the War of Algeria in 1962. This is the system. And in fact, so you also had segregated school in South US until the 1960s, of course, but the inequality in budget per student was actually not as extreme in South US. I mean, we've not done exactly the same computation, but from what you can see, it was the segregation was just as extreme, but the inequality in monetary investment was not as large as in French colonial Algeria. Now, this is sort of the one of the big starting point of the modern world, is that we come from this colonial legacy where, we come from a system with fairly extreme exploitation of, natural resources at the world level with all the consequences for carbon emission, global warming that we see today, but also, exploitation of human resources, sometimes in a very brutal manner, with a graduation, from slavery colonialism, post-slavery colonialism. Here we are very far away from a slave society, so this is a much more subtle form of domination, but as you can see, it is not so subtle after all. You have a very segregated school and very unequal school budget. Now, if we compare to the situation later on, so, this is the distribution of education today. So, France 1910 or France 2020 look almost equal as compared to Algeria 1950. In fact, they are still very unequal. Because if you look, so let's take France 1910. Okay, you could say, the top 10% of children, they are receiving only 35 to 40% of resources. The bottom 50% are receiving 25%. Okay, except that the top 10% children, they are 5 times less numerous than the bottom 50% children. So it means that, in fact, in a per pupil spending, they receive a lot more. And so, in fact, France 1910 corresponds to a very hierarchical system where basically most of the children, working class children, will just go to very basic primary school, no chance to go to secondary school, no chance to go to higher education, of course, and only, the elite or the top 10% would have a chance to go to secondary school and less than 1% to higher education. So this corresponds to actually a very stratified school system, very large inequality, but you can see as compared to a colonial setting that, it's not the same world in terms of level of segregation. So you have a whole graduation in educational inequality. You can be, extremely unequal, very unequal. Now, if we look today, France 2020, so but what I mean by 2020 is that these are the cohort of children who are turning 18 in 2020. And again, this is the same metric. I am looking at all these children in France, and we have very good data for this. We are looking at those who receive the highest education spending, those who receive the smallest education spending, and we look at the share they receive. So the top 10% is receiving only 20% of the resources, and the bottom 50 is receiving 35. But in fact, because the top 10% is 5 times less numerous than the bottom 50, the gap in resources corresponds to a factor of 1 to 4, 1 to 5 in public resources given to this different group of children. And the raw data, which corresponds to this yellow graph here, is given here, which here I have put the amount in terms of educational investment. So here I have ranked, the children by percentile of the total education they receive. So the average is 120,000 euros. So this is the total public educational investment from kindergarten, primary school, secondary school, and university. So the people at the top, they receive 250, 300,000 euros. And the people at the bottom, they receive like 60, 70,000 euros. And so, this is incredible inequality because these are public resources. So the public resources in education are, like 4 times bigger for the children who receive the most and for the children who receive the less. And this is this very equal world in yellow. So, you can imagine the other situation. So, it's like what we've seen before for inequality of wealth. There's been a movement toward more equality, but what we have today is very far from inequality. So who are, in the context of France, who are these different people who are getting so very different amount of resources? Almost everybody is going to primary, secondary school and have roughly the same spending. Also, it's not quite true because you get more experienced teachers and higher wages in better off places. So there is some inequality that's due to that a little bit, and this goes in the wrong direction. There's a lot of speeches about giving extra resources to disadvantaged schools, but if you look at the numbers, in fact, the little extra money that's given to disadvantaged schools is not anywhere near to compensate for the fact that you have more experienced teachers with higher wages in better off neighborhoods. So in fact, the system, including in primary and secondary school, is doing the opposite of what it's supposed to do. But the main inequality today comes from higher education. So basically, the people at the bottom who receive 60, 70,000 euros are the people who leave school before entering higher education. So the school leaving age is 16. So these are the people who leave school at 17 or 18, and you still have a fair number of them in France, where you have about 55 to 60% of a cohort now is going to higher education. People in the middle are the people who go to the sort of normal university tracks, which are not very well funded in France, as compared to people at the top, who are people who go in elitist school, so-called grande école in the French context, where you have selective preparatory classes, much better teacher-to-student ratio, much bigger financial means, and the official spending per student in this elitist part of the public higher education system is 3 to 4 times larger than the spending per pupil in the middle. Now, this is viewed as fair because people don't pay. This is not, this is free. So this is supposed to be okay, as opposed to US inequality, which I have shown you before the break, where you have this enormous inequality in access to university, partly because in tuition fee. Except, and it is true that it is particularly extreme in the US, except that it's not enough to have a public system to have equality in education. So in the French case, people are very proud that, you don't have these very high tuition fees. But in practice, you are putting public resources much more for the children who go to the selective school, who in practice happen to be from much better off backgrounds than the people who are at the bottom of this distribution. Although the correlation is not 1-to-1, of course, but there's a high correlation. So what I mean here is that we are not at the end of the process toward equality. And in a way, and let me make clear that it's complicated. It's in a way, equality at the level of primary, secondary education was easier than at the level of higher education, because for primary, secondary education, you can sort of say, okay, 100% of a cohort should go to at the end of primary, 100% of a cohort at the end of secondary. So you have a sort of target in terms of equality that is relatively clear. When it comes to higher education, you're not going to say my target is 100% of a cohort with a PhD in economics. Well, first that would be very useless, I think. And next, people have different tastes, and you have there are lots of good reasons why the higher education system has to have different curriculum, but then you have to organize it in such a way that you don't create such enormous inequality. And I think no country is in a situation to say, I have found the perfect system, just do what I do. You know, I think we all have to be very modest. There's a lot of hypocrisy everywhere. And the only way to make progress is to try to be as transparent as possible and I think try to compute this data, set targets, you know, try to make government accountable. You know, what's your target? Are you happy with this situation in France, or are you happy with this situation in the US? Is this the best you can do? Is this your target? What's your target? How are we going to measure the progress? What algorithm, what budgetary allocation process, what admission process are you going to use in order to achieve this target? But if we just remain at the level of very abstract discussion, are you in favor of equal opportunity? Yes, I am in favor of equal opportunity, but you don't do anything, you know, it's all a bit fake. And so, you know, I think there's a lot of hypocrisy in this discussion about inequality, which needs to be questioned, in particular when it comes to education. Then there's the issue of climate reparation, which is extremely important, which we already discussed this morning. I just want to stress again that to me, the 21st century is going to be a time when sort of post-colonial reparation and climate reparation are going to come together. And, you know, the only solution is that a coalition of the South puts sufficient pressure on the North, and ideally with the alliance of some of the opinion in the North, to bring this transformation, which to me should take the form of, in particular, of a global wealth tax in order to pay for a much more ambitious adaptation fund and mitigation funds than what has been discussed so far. This will take a lot of time, but what we need to keep in mind is that you have this huge inequality of emission within country. So again, you know, the bottom 50% in Europe has less emissions than the top 10% in South Asia. So if you just ask for a country-to-country transfer, that's going to be very difficult, because the public opinion in the North, at least those who are in the bottom for 50% or middle 40%, are going to say, well, look, you know, I'm not the one to blame. In fact, they have benefited from historical emissions, that's for sure, but, you know, that's going to be very difficult. Whereas if you have an instrument which sort of breaks nation-to-nation boundaries and looks at a class conflict from a global perspective, trying to make the global billionaire or the global rich contribute to the fund, then you have a chance. It's still going to be very difficult, but at least you have a chance to try to make a coalition with at least part of the opinion in the North. But in the end, you know, I have no doubt that most of the pressure and most of the political change will have to come from the South. Now, this brings me to the case of India. So this is, you know, data on inequality in India, which we have computed with Nitin Bharti, Anmol Somanshi, and Lucas Chancel, which I have presented already yesterday at the panel discussion. And I want to be fast just to say that in the context of India, you know, there's been a big rise in inequality in recent decades. In the very last few years, there's maybe a stabilization of inequality when it comes to income. When it comes to the very top, and in particular to wealth, there's a continuation, or if not an acceleration of the trend toward more inequality. If you look at income, you know, there's maybe a stabilization, which is partly due also to COVID and to low growth, so it's not necessarily sustainable. But even if it's a stabilization at a very high level of inequality, you know, that's not particularly satisfactory. You know, if you compare the situation in India today with other countries around the world, okay, you have South Africa, which is more unequal, but apart from that, you don't have much on the map. So, you know, it's the data is imperfect, but I think the orders of magnitude are okay. And, you know, it's difficult to have this discussion with government officials in India, because sometimes they take it very defensively and they take it as a critique to what they do, which I don't intend it as a critique. You know, I know it's difficult, but I think you cannot refuse the idea of international comparison. You know, at some point, you have to accept that you can learn from comparing one country to the other. You know, every country is exceptional and unique in some ways, but you cannot be completely exceptional, completely unique. There's always some things that you can learn. And, you know, the idea that inequality in India had to increase because it was too low before liberalization and now is the right level. I understand the argument, but it really doesn't square very well with the empirical evidence we have, because if you take China, China inequality has increased also since liberalization, but even today it is less than what it was in India before liberalization. So, the level of inequality you have today in India just seems excessive by any comparative standard and historical standard. And, I think what this implies, to be very concrete, is that we made with Nitin and Anmol concrete proposal to tax the very rich in India that will bring, so we have several proposals, baseline, moderate, ambitious. You will find it online in the World Inequality Lab website. We have published all of this earlier this year. Some people will think that baseline moderate is not moderate at all. In fact, I think ambitious is not that ambitious. 5% per year in tax rate annually on very large wealth is not so ambitious. But the bottom line is that the tax revenue are very substantial. In terms of percentage of GDP, we can get a lot of money. Just to make things a bit more concrete, if we compare this tax revenue to health and education spending, so you can see in the moderate scenario, you can basically double total health or education, or triple education if you don't put anything in health. So we're talking about big money. And I think, look, I'm not saying you can solve every problem of India and every problem in the world by taxing billionaires. I know the number. I look at the distribution of income and wealth, so I know that you need to have a broader based redistribution. And clearly, when you look at India today with 13-14% of GDP in tax revenue, whereas in Sweden it's 50 or 47 or 50%, you're not going to do that just by taxing billionaires. But if you want to be able one day to get, for instance, more people to pay income tax in India, you have 10% of the population paying income tax today in India. Probably in the long run, it should go to 20, 30, 40, like it happened in other countries. But before you can do that, you have to demonstrate to the public opinion and to the people already who are in the top 10% or top 20% of Indians and who are not incredibly rich by international world standards, you have to convince them that people at the very top, very top billionaires in particular, are paying more than they do as a fraction of their wealth and as a fraction of their income. And in the case of billionaires, we already discussed this morning, they underreport their income so much to the income tax that there's no way you can make them pay a decent share by the income tax alone. So you need a wealth tax to try to get a minimum level of tax justice, which then can allow you to bring other parts of the population, to contribute to the mobilization of resources for education, health, public infrastructure, which is the true source of productivity improvement in the long run. Now, let me move. I'd be very happy to respond to questions about this, or we can do this later if you want. But if there are questions now, please. Yeah. So the microphone. Yeah, it's good if we have a little break now, a little discussion about this, and then I will move to the last part, which was the political cleavage part of the research I wanted to show you.
So I wanted to ask, what do you think is a realistic way of implementing this? Because, especially in developing countries, because the government is mostly, it will never do anything against the richer section of the society. They are mostly puppets to the billionaires. So if we have an alternative political party that actually thinks about progressive taxation, the public will not vote for that government because they do not have the consensus on taxation. So how long do we wait for people to actually understand and something to happen?
Yes, so look, I don't want to take the defense of the puppet government, but I'm not here for that. But at the same time, I think you should not be too excessive. I think you are right that you have financial pressure on government, funding of media, funding of political parties, which have huge impact on what governments are standing for. But at the same time, you also have democratic forces, mobilization, and historically what we see is that sometimes this can deliver real change. So, how did we get, this 90% tax rate under Roosevelt that I was showing before? This was still US democracy with all its imperfection, with, very unequal system for funding the media, very unequal political finance system, but then democratic mobilization was stronger than this. And I told this morning about the case of Sweden, coming from a system of political inequality, which, as compared to this, India today looks like a dream egalitarian democracy. And still it works. So, I'm not saying it's easy, but, I think things can happen. I have heard that this year's election in India were not as successful for the party in power as what they expected. There will be other election. Yeah, so things can change, and this is what has happened already in other countries. And as far as the billionaire tax is concerned, again, what I said this morning, the very fact that now we have sort of official discussion in G20 as something that needs to be done, I think, is also a sign that things can change. But, there are still major battles to be fought here. Yes?
Hi. So firstly, I wanted to ask, how do you go about measuring wealth, especially in India, where there is a great deal of black money and shadow economy and stuff like that? Also, B, it's only recently in the past, I think, decade or so that tax evasion has lessened and the tax base has grown because of recent reforms. So wouldn't raising the upper income wealth tax or tax rates and stuff like that, wouldn't just that lead us back to 1970s when we did not have a lot of tax collection?
So first of all, I agree that at this stage, increasing the income tax rate will not be very useful, especially for the people at the very top, because as I said, they have a reported income that is so small as compared to their real wealth that, you can increase the tax rate to 90% if you want. That's not going to make them pay any tax. So that's why I think we have to start from a direct wealth tax. And I think, the Indian government, or, more generally government across the world, including in developing countries, have more administrative capability to do that than we sometimes imagine. You need strong political will and strong political mobilization, but in terms of technical capacity, the idea that people can just fly away with their wealth and there's nothing you can do is wrong. I mean, this is part of the propaganda of people who don't want anything to happen, of course, but it's just wrong, because when you have made your wealth in India, you have accumulated assets in India, you have benefited from the infrastructure of India, the legal systems, the education system. You cannot just live like this. As long as you have assets in the country, the government is perfectly legitimate to vote a law saying, you can go to Switzerland or Cayman Island if you want, but you're still liable to this tax as long as you have accumulated your wealth in India. In the US, they have this law saying as long as you have your US passport, you can go to Switzerland if you want, you will still pay the same US tax. I think this is not the best system, because you could also drop your passport. So I think a better system is really the number of years of residence you spent in a country. And every country, has the legitimacy to decide this. You don't need to ask the permission to the United Nations or the US to decide that, if you have accumulated your wealth in India, you should keep paying tax in India, even if you decide to live in the Cayman Island. And then if you don't pay, well, then you will be subject to the same sanction as anybody who doesn't pay your tax. So, if you have assets in India, they will be confiscated. If you come to the airport in India without paying your tax, well, maybe you will have to respond to a policeman. Just like everybody else. It's at some point, if you don't pay your tax, if you don't follow the law, you have there are consequences. So. I think there are more possibilities than we typically assume. I don't know if this is responding entirely to your question, or if there is any other question on this. If this is not responding entirely, please ask again. I can see. Yes, please.
Particularly in the context of India, we do have a greater underground economy, and a lot of the wealth of the rich people, like politicians or big businessmen, it's not entirely on books a lot of the times. So, like, how do we go about that? And then wouldn't, like, in the case of income, as you said, it's underreported because obviously they do not want to get taxed and they do not want to, lose that income. If we were to go ahead and somehow get a wealth tax in place, wouldn't these people just find other ways to evade that and to, like, underreport their wealth or
Okay.
shrug that off?
Okay, so I think I responded a little bit, but maybe not completely. Let me add one thing. This simulation, is made on the very, very top of the wealth distribution, which are basically the people whose wealth is evaluated in magazine. So we are talking of the very visible people, which I think, are very visible, are very well known, and so maybe the magazines are getting it wrong in the way they value their wealth. So maybe they have a bit less, maybe they have a bit more. In fact, nobody knows really, and it's a bit sad that we live at a time where people have to buy magazines to look at the wealth of top people. And I think it would be better if, indeed, the government was, in principle, the government. You have to understand that the system of private property rights cannot work without a public legal system that guarantees these private property rights. And in particular, you have a register of real estate, but you have also a register of equity, stock market, financial assets, titles, because you need when you have a conflict over property, you need the legal system to make clear that this is my property, it's not your property. So at the end of the day, this legal system is controlled by public authorities, by the government, and it's a matter of political will. So especially to implement it. So especially here, because here we are talking of literally a few thousand people, or I don't remember in this particular simulation, or a few hundred, or at most a few thousand people. So when it comes to administering a wealth tax with million or dozens of million people, this requires more steps maybe to develop your register. But even then, I think what's important to remember is that, information technologies are not useful only for the private sector. They are also useful for the public sector. And we should have a pre-filled income declaration, pre-filled wealth declaration, where, on the basis of the register, on the basis of a recent transaction in your area, on the basis of market price for on the stock market, you don't even have to fill a declaration. It's all pre-filled, and if you have some corrections to make, please explain why. But this is not so complicated to organize. I don't know where to start. Yeah, please. Maybe a micro would help. I mean, for me, it's okay. No, but it's okay. Okay. I am in the estimate for inequality in France that I have shown you before. It's only France's current territories, which includes, as you know, a number of ex-colonies, Réunion Island, Martinique, Guadeloupe, but that's very small. That's like 2% of the population. If we were to include the full colonial empire as it existed at different points in time, of course, the total population. So, if you were to add India to Britain when India was part of the British Empire, of course, the population of Britain will be multiplied by 6, so it will be a very different set of population. In the case of France, it's not as extreme, but it's also quite extreme. So, in the interwar period, at the maximum level of the empire, metropolitan France had 40 million inhabitants, and the empire was like 60, 70 million inhabitants. So, if we were to look at inequality within this 110 million area, inequality would have been enormous, of course, because the bottom, more than half of the colonized would have very low income. So it will. I mean, we could compute it. We have actually the data to compute it, but it's not really meaningful because to compare it with inequality within metropolitan France today. So I think that's why I prefer, when I've shown you the data on educational spending, I think it's a more sort of concrete way to see how colonial inequality would reproduce itself. And then if you want to see the global consequences on income inequalities, then you have to put together the different countries of the world and the different regions of the world and see the impact of colonialism on inequality. And here, the big historical lesson is of course, that at the time of colonial empires, inequality between countries increased enormously. And to summarize, colonization was very much to the benefit of the colonial powers, and whereas the colonized countries, remained extremely poor, if not, in some cases they became even poorer. Partly of this very unequal educational legal system, but this was, of course, much more general than this. And I think today we are still very much in the legacy on this. I was talking of the tax system earlier, the climate reparation, but it's much broader. So if you look at the financial system today, so there is some work that we have done at the World Inequality Lab recently by Gaston Nievas and Alice Sodano from Argentina and from Italy, where they have tried to compute the complete south-north transfer today in recent years or recent decades due to the world financial system and to the fact that rich countries are getting higher rate of return on their assets than poor countries, and they are paying much lower rate of return on their liability. And this is well known that it exists, but what I didn't know before their research is the magnitude of the increase of this sort of rich country privilege in the world financial system in recent years. And in particular, France and other European countries, for a long time used to complain about the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, who could borrow at very low interest rate and make a lot of money out of this. But in fact, this has become, now they benefit from the same privilege. So this has become a sort of privilege of the euro, of the yen, and of rich countries in general. And the total transfer, is the order of 2% of world GDP each year, so just for the differential in interest rate of return. So it's much bigger than all the flow corresponding to what we sometimes call development aid, and which sometimes is used to pay the Western consultants. And in any case, the money that corresponds to development aid is a lot smaller than this transfer going from south to north. So just saying that the world economic system and its organization are still extremely unequal in different ways than at the time of colonial empires, but in ways that are still very much present for today. And that needs to be changed in the future, just like the tax system I was referring before. Okay, if there is no other question, but please, yes.
My question is regarding the Indian situation. As you shown that there is inequality in India also, but we have other problems like opportunities and quality. Well, like we don't have much entrepreneurship here. We don't have ease of doing business here. So we need to focus on that also, and for that we need to reduce taxes and all. And on the other side, like even though USA has a higher education inequality, but still many of us wants to go there, so because the quality is higher there. My question is that whether in India we should focus on inequality or we should focus on the quality and opportunities like factors more. Which one should we focus more?
Yeah, we would all prefer to have less tax, that's for sure. But I'm just saying, with a global tax rate in India of 13 to 14% of GDP in total tax revenue, I would like this to be enough to pay for everything, for good public services in all areas, public infrastructure, education, health, that would be fantastic. But I am not a magician, you are not a magician, and this is simply not going to work. I'm saying this just because if you compare to other countries and you don't see any example of a country which so little money, such a small fraction of its GDP is able to do it. So now once you've said that, you're not going to jump to 20%, 30% next year, because this will be unacceptable for people. So this has to be very gradual. And in fact, in countries that built up their social side, look at the graph I have shown you. This happened over decades and centuries. So I'm not saying, it will necessarily take time. But sometimes we don't have so much time, so we have to see, how to speed up the process. And in any case, this will have to come with more tax justice, I think, from the top. Now, for the fact that U.S. universities are very attractive, yeah, of course, if you are able to be admitted to the good university, it's very good. And even the middle universities, as compared to the funding you are getting in Indian universities, I think it can be quite attractive. There's no discussion for that. And the US as a country, is benefiting a lot from this inflow of skilled people from everywhere else. And I'm not going to blame them for that or blame the US for that. Now, from a global perspective, you cannot get everyone to go to the US. So you have to think of different solutions for the rest of us, and for the, so that cannot be the answer for everybody. But I fully understand that some go for that. Okay, so maybe now let me move to another part of the talk, and this will be for the last 25 minutes or so, where I thought it was 10 to 3, 10 past 3. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, including Q&A, which we have already started, as you have noticed. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to show you a few results about political cleavage, and please interrupt me and ask me questions, and we can start the Q&A right away if you prefer. It's okay with me. I thought it will be useful to show you a little bit about this other research projects that I have been developing in recent years. So the key question is really about the political economy of redistribution, which is an issue we've been talking already since this morning. But here I want to open a little bit more the black box of politics, and sort of to better understand who votes for whom. So, what do we know about the interaction between political cleavage, socioeconomic inequality, and its evolution over time? So here, this is a research project where we try to understand, why is it that in some historical period in some countries you get redistribution, and some historical period in some countries you don't get redistribution? Why is it that you have a political system opposing high redistribution, low redistribution, maybe left-wing, right-wing parties, and in some other setting, this is not a good description of the political system? So what determines the structure of political conflict and who votes for whom? So this is a very broad research program which we have developed, and the preliminary results are available in the World Political Cleavage and Inequality database. And there's one article, a sort of summary article, which we published in 2022 with Amaury Guettin and Clara Martinez-Toledano, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. Now, if you want to know more about this project, and if some of you want to participate also, I should say the World Inequality Database and the World Political Cleavage and Inequality Database are collective, participatory projects. We are adding new countries, new data all the time. We have India here, but as you will see, this was actually not updated to the very last election, but still we have the results going from the 1962 election to 2014, and the pattern we have for 2019-24 are not very different from what we have until 2014 as a first approximation. But, there are many other data, including for India, that could be included, and also adding other countries. So we cover 50 electoral democracies from 1948 to 2020. Half of them are Western electoral democracy, half of them are non-Western, and we're still adding new all the time. So maybe let me start from a simple graph which sort of summarizes a lot of the findings what we have in Western democracies. And then we'll see that the non-Western democracies, in particular India, have quite a different pattern. But let's start with Western democracies. So what we have on this graph, so it's a bit complicated maybe, so let me explain. We're trying to see who is the sort of elite voting for, or at least people at the top as compared to people at the bottom. Now the thing is that there are different dimensions of social stratification which are correlated, but they are never completely correlated. So in particular, let's take the education dimension and the income dimension. In practice, when you're in the top 10% of education, you are likely to be in the top 10% of income, but not always. It's not perfectly correlated because income also depends on your wealth, depends on lots of other characteristics, your gender, your age, all other dimensions, which we also control for, by the way. And so here's the situation. We are trying to look. So if you look here at the red curve and the blue curve, you know, we are basically trying to look who vote for the different political parties. And what we find here in this graph, we are looking for the difference in the fraction of people voting for left-wing parties among the top 10% educated and the bottom 90% educated, and among the top 10% earners in income and bottom 90% earners. So when it's negative, when it's below zero, it means that the top is voting less for the left than the bottom, therefore that the top is voting more for the right. So we start from a situation, so you can see that in the 60s, 70s, or even early 80s, the top education and top income groups were voting more for right-wing parties in Western democracy. So here by left-wing parties, we mean, you know, Democratic Party in the US, Labour Party in the UK, Social Democratic Party in Germany, Socialist Communist Party, sometimes Green Party. You have all the detailed results country by country if you go there, but you have the same pattern basically for every Western country. That's what's very striking. And so to summarize, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the left-wing parties were getting most of their vote from the less educated and lower income. So the political conflict was very much what you would describe as a standard sort of left-right conflict, where people at the bottom would vote for the left and people at the top would vote more for the right. And this was true whatever the dimension of social stratification you are interested in. So everything was nicely aligned. Whether you're at the bottom in education, you vote for the left, bottom of income, you vote for the left, bottom of wealth, you vote for the left. If you are everywhere in the bottom, you vote even more for the left. So, you know, everything is nice and cumulative and simple. At the end of the period, things have changed. The high educated have actually turned to left parties, except when they have a very high income, in which case they still vote for the right. So, you know, the people that would vote the most for the left are people with very high degree. So, you know, PhD, an unemployed PhD on sociology, you know, will be sort of the chief left-wing voter. But, you know, there are very few, so that's not going to matter. So who are the people with actually high degree and low income? Well, you know, they could be, you know, you could have some public sector workers who could be also, you know, primary school teachers, secondary school teachers, nurses. You know, you have lots of people who have quite a high education degree as compared to the average of their country, but don't have a very high income as compared to, you know, some people who have a more business-minded activity with less education but higher income. And in any case, what you see is that at the end of the period, the higher education have moved to the left, but higher income are still to the right. Now, in the US, which is sort of one of the chief examples of this evolution, the higher income have now also turned to the left, to the Democratic Party. And if you look at the very recent election in 2024, but it was already the case for the first Trump election in 2016, the blue curve is now above zero. So now the Democratic Party is getting more votes, not only among the more educated, but also among the higher income. So the entire political system has turned back on itself. And it started with education, and then it moved to income, which you can interpret also as saying as, you know, in the long run, if you win the high human capital vote, you finally win also the high monetary income vote. It does not necessarily go hand in hand, because you could have different specialty of, you know, some low income, high education people, but at least in the US, it seems to be going this way. So what has been happening? That's the big questions that we're asking. The first thing is that, once again, I think this is an example where we need to do historical research, because these are long-term evolution. If you just say everything is because of Donald Trump, you know, you're missing something, because, you know, there are long-run evolutions, they are happening in many countries. It's more than a question of one personality or the other. You know, there's a deeper process going on. So that's what we're trying to understand in this book. So, you know, we spend a lot of time looking at each country. What's very striking, so here, you know, these are three countries, US, France, Britain. what's very striking is that you have the same evolution, although these are very different parties. Like the Democratic Party has very little to do with the Socialist and Communist Party in France. The Democratic Party in the US used to be the party of slavery, completely different historical roots. Labour Party, it's interesting to see that Labour Party in Britain is following the same evolution, but in fact is a little bit lagging behind, which means that the Labour Party historically had a stronger working class roots than both the Democratic Party in the US but also the Socialist Communist Party in France. So the Labour Party in the UK was more working class, but in the end, it has become also stronger among educated. So we look, you can look separately at each country, and there's a lot to see, but you have basically the same pattern in pretty much every Western democracy. So this is before any control. If you control for income, it's even more striking because given that higher income tends to push you to the right, other things equal, once you control for income, the effect of higher education putting you more to the left is even stronger. But this does not affect the trend, which is very robust with or without control. You can look election by election. So this is just a graph in France. So you can see in France in 1956, 1958, 1962, the more educated will vote for the right. In recent elections, they always vote for the left. You have the same for the US. So say 1948 in the US, high educated vote Republican. So the idea that the high educated always vote Democrats is just wrong. In fact, for a long time, you can see 1948, 1960, the high educated were voting Republican like crazy. And recently, you look at people with a PhD in 2016. Which are 2% of the population, so they are the new Brahmin, if you want, in our typology. They 75% vote for Hillary Clinton, and I don't even know where the 25% voting for Donald Trump are hiding on campuses because they are not very visible. This is maybe changing a little bit, but anyway, you have this shift in the education pattern of vote, which is very striking, which you see very nicely for the US. There will be a lot more to say about this, but the short, story, the interpretation that we develop is that, gradually the left-wing party have sort of abandoned their sort of working class platform and their redistributive agenda. It happened very gradually. So, what happened also is that because of educational expansion, the people who have been more successful in the educational competition have sort of remained loyal to the left, which had been pushing very much for the expansion of the educational system. And those who were sort of lagging behind in the educational competition also, could maybe partly were frustrated, are not happy to be looked down at them by the people at the top, especially in large cities. So, this has created a completely different set of power relation in politics, but in the end, this has turned the system around completely. And this is to have in mind if now we have to change this, and this comes with very high and new territorial inequalities, between rural territories and richer territories, which we had not seen for a long time. Let me just say that in the case of India, as you well know, the Brahmin don't vote for the left; they vote for the right, and so the party system in India it looks much more like a standard left-right party system than the Western party system, in the sense that higher income, higher education, higher caste voters, and all of this is largely correlated, but not completely, vote much more for BJP than average. This has always been the case. So this is data for BJP. So this is a paper that we did with Abhijit Banerjee and Amory Gessin, and which we published a few years ago, which is also on the website. So sorry, we start in 2014. We're going to update the data to 2019-24, but trust me if I tell you that this is basically the same pattern. This has always been the same pattern. And so, okay, if you are a Muslim, usually you don't like a lot to vote for the BJP. I don't know why, but somehow, if you look at SC/ST vote, OBC, for our caste, the pattern is very clear. If you look at Congress vote, this is what you have. This is just of the reverse. And if you look at other left parties, so including SP, BSP, CPI, with lots of variation across states that you know more than me, you get also a very clear pattern. Now, this is by caste. We also do it by education, by income. This is all very correlated. Each of these dimensions seems to matter. The data in the post-electoral survey is not perfect. The number of observations is not infinite. So what we can do to distinguish between these different dimensions is limited, but from what we can see, all these dimensions seem to matter and seem to push in the same direction. So in that sense, the Indian party system is much more left-right than what we have in the West, which has become something very different. And so this is where, again, a comparative and historical perspective on this, I think, can be useful. And maybe can give rise to some optimism for India in the sense that I think a left-right party system is more likely to induce redistribution. Historically, this is what happened in the West, than this kind of multiple elite party system with high education going left, high income going right, and then the people who are poor in every dimension who feel completely excluded from the party system in the West. And I think this is the key problem we have right now. If you want to know more, look at this website. If you want to know even more, you can look at this book that we just published with Julia Cage, History of Political Conflict, Election and Social Inequalities in France. So this is coming out at Harvard University Press. So I'm sorry that this is another 1,000-page book. And this is only on one country, France. So you have to be a real passionate about France. So I'm not asking you to read it. I'm going to give you a one-slide summary of the book. The nice thing about France is that we have elections since the French Revolution. And so we've digitized with Julia all the election results at the commune level. We have 36,000 commune municipalities in France since the French Revolution. And we've tried to look in a systematic manner how people vote for. Now, as compared to the modern survey data, the advantage of the modern post-electoral survey data is that you have individual level data on how you vote. The problem is that survey size is limited and that surveys do not exist at all before the 1950s. So if you want a long-run historical perspective on who votes for whom, the only way to do it is to look at granular, local level data, comparing very poor municipalities with very rich municipalities, very rural, very urban, very agricultural, very industrial. So that's what we do in the book. The one graph I want to show you, so sorry, this is written in French, but you can learn a little bit in French at the end of these 3 lectures, and these 3 hours of lecture, and I will just explain you what's on this map, on this graph. So on this graph, you have for every legislative election between 1848 and 2022, and actually I have put also the results up to this year, 2024, coming from the European election, and we have the same for the recent legislative election. This is a measure of what I call the territorial gap. So basically, at every point in time, we split the French territory between the 50% most rural and the 50% most urban. On the basis of the size of the agglomeration, you can always, at any point in time, draw the line in terms of size of city and agglomeration and take the population, which is the 50% more urban and the 50% more rural. And you look at what's the vote for the left-wing party in the 50% most urban divided by the vote for the left-wing party in the 50% most rural. So this is a very simple indicator of territorial inequality. What do you get? Well, first, the ratio is always above 1. In other words, the urban world is always voting more for the left than the rural world. Now, you will tell me you already knew that. Marx already in 1848, writing about the French election, was complaining about the archaic French peasants that were voting with the bourgeoisie. So, there's nothing new under the sun, except 2 things. Well, first, it's always nice to test, your intuition. And here with 41 legislative elections, you always are above 1. So if you're looking for regularity in the social science, at least you have 1. And next, what's more interesting is that, in fact, this gap is not the same over time. And recently has returned to incredibly high level. You see, in 2024, if you look at this, the 50% most urban in France were voting for the left 1.4 times more than the 50% most rural, which is really an enormous gap because, within the 50% most urban, you have very poor suburbs, very rich suburbs, same in the most rural. So it's incredible to have such a big gap, which you didn't have basically since Karl Marx wrote in 1848. And so is this the return of the archaic peasant of Karl Marx? Well, no, because peasantry has disappeared, agriculture has disappeared. So what's going on? Well, first, it means that you cannot, you don't want to take as given the idea that, the rural world is backward, archaic, right-wing, and the urban world is progressive, etc. It doesn't work this way. It depends also on what you have to propose to the different territories. And probably in recent decades, and I should say, this is a graph for France, but the data we are now collecting for the US shows a very similar pattern, and we do it for other countries as well. This huge increase in territorial inequalities in recent decades, for us, have to do with the fact that, globalization has transformed the structure of productive sector in such a way that basically people, large agglomerations are benefiting a lot. They also have access to higher universities, so that's also related to the new pattern with respect to education. Smaller territory, more peripheral cities have difficulties coping with. They don't get access to the new public services, high quality hospitals, higher education, etc. And this has created a division between the rural and the urban working class, including within the wage earner population. So it's not the peasant of Karl Marx and the modern wage earners who are going to be revolutionary. So even within the wage earner group, you have this new division, which in effect has made it very difficult for the left parties to unite the rural poor and the urban poor as they were doing. Look in the post-war period or even in the 1980s, the urban and the rural are voting almost the same. So it means that if you take in the context of France, the 1981 election, the election of Mitterrand, which was the union of the left, he got almost the same score in small villages, large agglomeration. And so there's been a complete transformation. So this is even more striking if you look at the top 20% most urban. Let me stop there. This is related also to the vote for green parties, which tends to be quite well off. So, I don't have time to show you this, but if you rank municipalities by wealth, you can see that you get more vote for green ecological candidate in higher wealthy, in more wealthy municipalities, which is the contrary of all the historical pattern you see for all the left-wing vote, including, I like to compare with the Trotskyist vote, which is a small extreme left group that you have in France, but they actually get almost as much vote as the Green Party, and they are actually very rural vote and very lower class vote. Very poor municipalities vote for them. So that's basically what we try to understand in this book is the interplay between what we call geo-social class, the spatial dimension, and the vertical dimension of social stratification. And we think this is at this interaction that we need to do new research on more countries in order to better understand this transformation of political cleavages. So I have tried to summarize everything quite fast. There's a lot more research that could be done on this, including on India, which is, has more voters than all other democracies combined in this book. So it's worth more than a chapter which we have in this book, only a chapter on India, which you will find online. But this is where we stand now. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I hope this has convinced you that an historical perspective on issues of inequality and political economy can be interesting. Thanks a lot for your attention.
So just 2 or 3, say about 3 questions. One question there, please.
Thank you for the insightful lecture, Professor. I wanted to know what is the role of monetary policy in your opinion to curb inequality, because you focused mainly on the fiscal policy aspects where inheritance tax and wealth tax can be used to curb inequality. But what do you think is the role of monetary policy? Is it just to maintain and curb inflation and maintain price stability? Or do you think central banks can do more to reduce this problem? Thanks.
So we'll take all the questions. Another
So in one of the graphs that you showed regarding the difference between the top 10% and 90% in voting for the democratic parties, in this one, so maybe this is just a bad observation, but is it the case that US has more consistent cyclicality? And if that's the case, then is that representative of some kind of systemic strength, or it's just a completely wrong read?
Afternoon, Professor. So this concerns one of the graphs that you displayed on the charts you had displayed on the screen, where one gets to see the decreasing size of the welfare states. What's also very striking about the chart that when you notice the proportion, the expenditure on the retirement plans as a proportion of the total expenditure on the welfare, you see a steady increase in the size of that pie. Now, that coupled with the fact that there has been an aging population, South Korea, for example, lately has been in the news for all the bad reasons, and one of the problems that they've been encountering is the aging population. What interaction will that have on the inequality? I understand that you've discussed this case from the perspective of the rise in the financial burden on the younger generation. But if you look at it in the context of the impact on inequality, how do you see that evolving?
Okay, one last question. Yes, please. How do you define left parties? Because left party gradually have changed their ideological positions over the year. I mean, how do you captures their evaluations of
which party in which
left parties? Because left party changed their ideological positions.
You mean, sorry, Liberal Party in the UK? No, sorry, which party?
I mean, everywhere. I mean, if you say USSR or India or UK, everywhere. Left party changed their culture, ideological positions. And this is one. Second thing is that when you're talking about the taxation, definitely taxation is one instrument for redistribution. But why can't really a state can be engaged on some economic activities? Because then they could also generate some income. Because when, let's say, at least where the private sector is not actually coming up and doing the good job, because when the reform was taking place that time, we were saying that the government is supposed to be having bureaucrats, bureaucracy is going to kill efficiency. Now, because of the digitalization of this, that efficiency could be somehow rested. So why can't really ask states to do some kind of economic activity?
Can you tell me again which party you talk about, because I did not understand?
Left-wing parties.
But these are the one I look at. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we are exactly trying to understand how their electorate has changed. That's the question we've been asking.
No, so the two kinds of parties, left-wing parties, they have changed their ideological positions.
Of course, that's what I'm saying.
So
okay. Yeah. I mean, this is what I'm saying, but in order to understand to what extent they have changed their ideological position, I think looking at who votes for them is exactly the right way to go, together with their platform, of course. But you see what I mean? That's the purpose of the research project, is exactly to understand who votes for them. But you should not be, these names, parties don't always change their names, they keep their name, but that doesn't mean they say the same thing, okay? That's what we're looking at, okay? Of course, I mean, if nothing had changed, they would have the same electorate. But okay, maybe if there are, I can answer more to this.
I think that's all. We have time for these questions.
So, well, maybe let me start with this to continue on this. You're perfectly right. They have completely changed their ideology. That's what I'm trying to understand. But then the important point is that you can see that their change in ideology has come together with a gigantic transformation, which is educational expansion, which is not, which is something that has some very positive ingredients with it. And I'm not saying that it was unavoidable with the educational expansion, that this happens. But we have to put the two together. That's what I'm saying. There's probably the best book to describe this is the so-called the book actually which invented, the term meritocracy. This book which is called the Rise of Meritocracy, which is written by this British sociologist called Young. What is his first name? Whatever. Well, it was published around 1950. Who was a Labour Party activist. And he wrote this book as this was a sort of nightmare scenario for the future, a dystopia, where he was imagining a world where the more educated will shift to the Labour Party, to the Conservative Party. Well, basically that there will be the less educated will be left over completely, and everything will end up in a revolution where the sociologist himself will lose his life in the middle of a demonstration, and the book will stop there. Sometime in 2030, I think, something like that. You should read this book. This is an incredible book. And the message that this British sociologist wanted to send to the Labour Party of his time was, be careful with educational stratification. Don't follow the step of the Conservative Party. So yes, this is the story we are talking about. Okay, finishing with this. Someone asked me, are there some cycles which you have particularly in the US? I think this is more a sample size problem. So, this is the problem with the post-electoral surveys, that, you have a few thousand observations. I have the same graph with the standard error. You will see that it's okay for the long-term trend, which are definitely robust, but some of the election-to-election variation, are not completely reliable. That's why actually we need to use the granular level data to try to infer the individual level relation in a more robust manner. Now let me respond to a question on monetary policy. Is this important, or is everything should come from the budget and from the tax system? No, I think monetary policy is extremely important. Can play a role which no tax policy can play. In particular, monetary policy can react very fast to big crises, as we know. The big limit of monetary policy is, of course, inflation. So once you start to have inflation, at some point, there are limits to what you can do. That being said, there are lots of things that you can do with monetary policy, in particular with favoring green investment or making it impossible to do certain kind of investment, so targeted financing, which I think will be very important in the future. And when we talk about monetary policy, I think we should not forget about the international dimension of the system, and the international financial system, the reform of the international financial system I was referring to earlier. And I think the inequality in rate of borrowing that you have today across the world, is really the number one issue. And rich countries are still wondering, by which miracle are we able to borrow at 0%? And in my country, in France, they still don't understand. They have a 6% deficit, but real interest rate is 0. And what's happening? And where does this miracle come from? Well, the miracle comes from the rest of the world is paying huge interest rate because you have all this saving coming from all over the world who are ready to go into Western financial systems with no return, partly to dissimulate themselves from the tax authorities from India and other countries, which is not a particularly good reason, but that's part of what's happening. Partly because their lack of confidence in the financial system, political system of their country, partly because banking regulation taken by the countries in the global north have made it compulsory for large banks, to purchase a lot of public bonds from the north, viewed as more secure, but this is sort of decided partly by legislation. So it's a mixture of reason, and partly because of the role in reserve currency of the dollar, but also of the euro. And this means that some of the discussions that Keynes was starting to have, in 1945 about, what do you do when countries have excess return or excess foreign income in their balance of payment, and Keynes at the time was even proposing, to have a taxation. So at the time, of course, Keynes was obsessed with the privilege of the dollar, and now that Britain and France also enjoy this nice privilege, maybe the Europeans are happy with that, but from the point of view of the rest of the world, it's not okay. So just to say that monetary matters and financial matters are at least as important as tax matters. And we should not choose, we both are important. And we need to be, very active on both. There was this question on state ownership, state activity. I think, what I have in mind is that the public sector, and more generally the non-profit sector, has been very important in the development in the social state in the 20th century, in education, in health, escaping the profit motive, and this has to expand a lot in the future. This doesn't need to be, property of the centralized state. This can be very decentralized actors, but with public funding and working outside the profit logic. I think I've responded almost to everything except maybe pension. Very high pension spending and very high health spending. It's not exactly the same, but both are related to aging, and health spending also to big technological advance in health, are very difficult to it's very difficult to avoid that, and maybe it's not so good to try to compress that. Now, the problem is that then, if you let this rise, which is a little bit what happened, then what you have left for education and public infrastructure and spending, which are more for the younger generation and for future economic activity, there's a strong tendency to compress those. And that's a risk in which we are today. And I think this is what explains a big part of the productivity slowdown. And so that's why we need to increase the resources we put into the entire system. Okay, thanks a lot for your attention.
Well, thank you so much for this extraordinary sort of range of ideas that you have given us. And everything considered, it continues to be true that India is possibly among the most unequal societies today in terms of income, at least. The top 10% earning about 55 to 60% of income. And as Professor has sort of repeatedly said, possibly this morning, this afternoon also, and in some of his newspaper interviews, he says that the maximum that should be permitted would be something like top 10%, maybe 35, 40% or 45%. 55 to 60% is too excessive. And India is possibly beaten only by South Africa in terms of income inequality. And there are many other things that have been talked about. So for this fantastic range of questions that you've raised and the concerns that you've talked about, many, many thanks. And let's give a big hand to Professor Piketty.
Thank you, Professor Piketty, for this knowledgeable session, and thank you, Professor Nayak, for chairing this session. Now I request Professor Ram Singh, Director of Delhi School of Economics, and Dr. Manish Kumar, Executive Director, Center for Development Economics, to kindly come up on the stage. And along with them, I request Professor Nayak to please present the memento to our speaker, Professor Thomas Piketty.
We can come this way. Send some flowers also. One more thing. One more thing.
Thank you, everyone. Now I request everyone to please head to the DSC lawns for tea. We will begin our parallel sessions at sharp 4, and after the parallel sessions, please join for the valedictory session and the Best Paper Award here in this hall at sharp 5. Thank you all for your presence.
Dr. Swati Saini, faculty at Delhi School of Economics, to the stage.
मैम अभी कोई आया नहीं है नहीं कैमरा ऑफ कर देंगे
अभी आप फिर एक सेकेंड
साउंड टेस्ट ठीक तो है कौन सा रहेगा
स्पीकर कहाँ है?
नहीं ये माइक्रोफोन में कैंसर है।
हाँ ठीक ये यही रहेगा बस।
स्पीकर में
ठीक तो है हेडफोन।
ठीक है
हाँ
कैमरा ठीक है
कीजिए ना आप।
अरे नहीं मना कर
इनका पहले एक बार टेस्ट कर देना जो भी है। ओ ये लाइट बंद कर दे ये लाइट बंद कर दो। हाँ
देखो JX EST GGP यही है। चालू कैसा चला नहीं है करेक्ट 5:35 पे किया
चलो वेट करते हैं
कर दिया था टाइम पे 5 मिनट से हो 5 मिनट से ज़्यादा हो
क्या किया जाए लिंक लेके इनएक्टिवेटेड रखिए
एक्टिवेटेड है चल रहा है वो थोड़ी देर बाद बंद हो जाएगा कोई नहीं आएगा तो अपने आप बंद हो जाता है वो खाली चलता नहीं रहता है शेयर करते हैं इसके
लेकिन उसमें एक्टिवेटेड है ना
मैं इसे ज्वाइन कर लेता हूँ ताकि मैं ज्वाइन रहूँ उसमें खत्म नहीं रहेगा ठीक
मैं तो अब बंद हो गया
Good evening, everyone. So, welcome to the valedictory session. So, as you know, the Winter School is organized in collaboration with the Econometric Society. So, today, Professor Andrew McLennan, who is at School of Economics, University of Queensland, he had to join us today for the valedictory session for announcing the Best Paper Award. But for some reason, we are not able to connect with him. So, Professor McLennan, I think, as I was saying, Professor McLennan, he is the chair of Schools and Workshops Committee at the Econometric Society, and we are thankful to him and the Econometric Society for the continuous and generous support they have been giving to the Winter School since 2018. So, the Best Paper Award that we are about to announce, it is in collaboration with the Econometric Society. They will be funding the award. So, without further ado, let me just talk about the Best Paper Award. So, the Best Paper Award, it will be, we are giving it in 3 categories, in 3 areas: macroeconomics, microeconomics, and development or applied economics. So, I will be announcing the names of the nominees in each of the area, and I request whomsoever's name I announce, please stand up so that everybody can know who is the nominee. So, the first area is macroeconomics. And the first nominee is Rahul Menon from Jindal Global University. And the title of his paper was, "And the Search Goes On, Job Search and Job Finding Rates in Urban India." Rahul Menon. Okay. So, next nominee is Abhishek Ranjan from Reserve Bank of India. So his paper was on a multi-factor GDP nowcast model for India. So Abhishek Ranjan. Third nominee is Prachi Bansal from OP Jindal Global University. So the title of her paper was Measuring Inflation Inequality in India. Fourth nominee is Parush Arora from Ashoka University. So Parush, if you are around. So the title of the paper is Regularized Opinion Pools for Density Forecast under Bayesian Inspired Framework. And I would like to call Sandeep to announce the Best Paper Award in the area of macroeconomics and also to give the award.
Okay, so if anyone from OPG University, I think Abhinandar is here, and you can.
Professor Thakur
So,
can.
I think the best paper in this category goes to Rahul Menon from OPG University, and the title was "And the Search Goes On: Job Search and Job Finding Rates in Urban India." I think Abhinandar, you can collect on behalf of Rahul, I guess. Yes, you please come forward. It's okay.
So in the area of microeconomics, so there was one nomination, and this paper has received the Best Paper Award in the area. I would like to call Rohit to announce the name of the awardee. Yeah.
So we only have one nomination, and the awardee is Satyam Kumar Rai from Ashoka University, who happens not to be here, and anyone from Ashoka? Yeah. So the paper is titled Information Transmission in Ethic Conflicts, Cheap Talks with Multiple Senders and Receivers.
Okay, so coming to the last area, which is development or applied economics. So there were 3 nominees. First nominee is Anisha Garg from University of Warwick, and the title of the paper is Safe Travels, Transport Advancement and Women's Safety in India. So Anisha, are you around? Okay. So second nominee from this area is Shubhangi Jaiswal from Shivnadar Institute of Eminence. Shubhangi. So the title of her paper is Educated Leaders and Political Effort. Third nominee is Athira Vinod from NCAR. And the title of her paper is Affirmative Action and Private Education Expenditure by Disadvantaged Groups, Evidence from India. Now I would like to call Varun on the stage to announce the Best Paper Award.
The Best Paper Award in Development and Applied Economics goes to Anisha Garg from the University of Warwick for her paper Safe Travels, Transport Advancement and Women's Safety in India. Please come.
Congratulations to all the winners and the nominees. Now I would like to call Dr. Manish on the stage for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Swati.
So on behalf of Center for Development Economics and the Organizing Committee of Winter School 2024, myself and so the names of the committee members, I'm just taking their names. Professor Ram Singh, Chair of Winter School Committee, Dr. Swati Saini, Dr. Varun Kumar Das, Dr. Sandeep Datta, and Rohit Parashar. So together we tried to do our best. I hope we could deliver what we promised. So briefly, I would like to talk about the selection process this year, selection of the papers that we did for this conference, especially during the parallel session. So last year, we tried to increase the horizon of this program by including someone from different institutes, some people from different institutes in Delhi and around Delhi as a chair or moderator of the session. So this year, we went one step ahead, and we actually, the selection process this year was actually very rigorous. So it was a kind of, not totally, but partly, it was kind of blind peer reviewed. So we approached almost 60 academicians in Delhi and around. So we also approached someone in Bangalore, we also approached someone in ISER Mohali, Azim Premji University, etc. So that was the scale. So while I may not be able to take all those names, but I will certainly take the names of their institutions. So for first, thank you from my side and on behalf of the Winter School Committee, I would like to thank National Agricultural Bank of National NABARD for assisting us not only in moderating the session but also in reviewing some of the papers. Some people from the Finance Commission, that they also assisted us. Center for Economic Studies and Planning, JNU, CITD, Center for International Trade and Development, JNU, Business Economics Department, Delhi University, NIPFP, CSRD, Center for Study of Regional Development, JNU, then Ambedkar University, Delhi, OP Jindal Global University, Aryabhatta College, Delhi University, Delhi School of Economics, obviously many faculty members participated in the review process, then IIT Jodhpur, Delhi Technical University, Department of Commerce, Delhi University, ISID, then Council for Social Development, Ashoka University, Faculty of Management Studies, IIIT Delhi, IIT Delhi, BML Munjal University, then Oxford Policy Management, India. So these many people, almost 60 or more than 60, participated in the review process. So we would like to thank you for your support and also your guidance. Obviously, funding is very important, and I would like to thank for generous funding, consistent generous funding from Murthy Trust, Narayan Murthy Trust, NABARD, and ICSSR. Organizing a conference of this scale is not possible without support of volunteers. And this time, when we are having conference here, parallelly, examinations are also going on. So PhD students also have their coursework, their examination, and despite that, we found 100% attendance in all sessions, including the vote of thanks session when we generally see a very less number of attendance. So we have very huge participation. They were available whenever we needed them. So we would like to thank, I would like to take their names. Bhavya, Rohit, Naveen Kumar Rai, Deepak Kumar Singh, Yuvraj Goswami, Jagdish, Saveri Sargam, Ramandeep, Rajan, Srishti Jaiswal, Sangeeta, Ankita, Priya Kumari, Vibhor, Kanishka, Chetan, Sanghamitra Gautam, Chandrabhushan, Gaurav, Himansi Agarwal, Sneha, Dauzal, Vivek, Anant, Rahul Singh, Shruti Yadav, Urvashi, Shivam, Kanupriya, Krishle, Sapna, Vidhisri, Neeraj, Arjun, Devesh, Jyoti, Shreyans, Vaibhav, Anurag, Jyoti Josna. So please, a big hand for them. Without their support, we could not have organized this event. We are also thankful to the staff of our Center for Development Economics led by Mrityunjay Singh Bist, CVG, Rajesh, Raju, Sonveer, Bhupender, Ashok. I would also like to thank staff of the department staff, Department of Economics staff, Department Director Office staff led by Meenaji. We would also like to thank the caterer who provided delicious food to all of us. I believe that you would agree with me. Mughal Darbar, the owner is Tausif. I would also like to thank the sanitation staff and security staff for providing a wonderful facility. They managed the very high number of people. They managed quite well. We would also like to thank for local communication, etc., travel support, Dharmendra, and all colleagues of Department of Economics. So with these words, I would like to conclude by saying that we are trying our best. We need more than appreciation, we need your support. When we are walking, we are trying to be more inclusive. We are trying our best to include everyone. We are trying our best to take everyone together. So no event, nothing can be possible without collective efforts. So our vision is to take everyone along, and in future also, I hope your support will continue. Thank you so much.